A cold hush lingers in the restricted vault, the kind of silence that seems carved into the stone walls themselves. The air is unnaturally still, as if the room is holding its breath. A thin beam of white light cuts across the darkness as the heavy steel door groans open. A curator in linen gloves steps inside, his heartbeat echoing louder than his footsteps. He moves with the reverence of a man entering a sanctuary, not an archive. On the table lies a long, cloth-wrapped object, unnaturally dense for its size. Sweat gathers on the curator's brow as he slowly unravels the fabric. What emerges is not parchment, nor clay, nor metal. It is a slab of deep sapphire, dark as midnight, yet shimmering with a blue that feels almost alive. As the final fold of cloth slips away, the slab catches the faint light and fractures it into ghost-like streaks along the vault ceiling. The curator stiffens. The stone is warm. He angles the slab gently, and something impossible happens. Beneath the glossy surface, faint lines begin to glow. A constellation of Greek letters etched in lines so thin they look like strands of moonlight frozen in crystal. They flicker with a soft luminescence, as if waking from centuries of slumber. The curator's throat tightens. The first line, half buried in a swirl of sapphire grain, reads, "In the beginning was the light." It is not a verse from any known gospel. It is close, too close, to something familiar yet unmistakably altered. Every scholar who has glimpsed this opening phrase has described the same thing. A sense of déjà vu layered on top of unease, as if the stone itself is rewriting memory. Under his trembling fingertips, the curator feels shallow grooves. These are no crude scratches. The letters have the precision of a master jeweler's hand. Yet the inscriptions are deeper than any chisel should allow, as if the words were not carved but grown inside the stone. Years earlier, when rumors of a blue gospel first circulated in hushed academic channels, most scholars dismissed the idea outright. A gospel carved into sapphire sounded like myth, alchemy, or another medieval forgery. But now, standing before this artifact, doubt feels childish. Nothing about the slab is theatrical or exaggerated. Feels ancient, heavy with purpose. A small group of experts gathers behind the curator, their faces illuminated by the stone's unnatural glow. One of them, an elderly epigrapher with trembling hands, leans closer. She murmurs that the lettering resembles 9th century Byzantine uncial script, but more disciplined, more deliberate, as if crafted by people who believed every stroke carried cosmic significance. Another expert, a geologist, runs a laser scanner across the surface. The readings spike in ways she cannot explain. Natural sapphire should be lightless, opaque at such thickness. Yet this slab, not polished, not thinned, allows letters to shine through like embers trapped beneath river ice. "Impossible," she whispers. The curator swallows and carefully flips the slab. The backside is smooth at first glance until the angle shifts. More letters emerge from the darkness, glowing faintly as if stirred by motion. But these lines are sharper, deeper, angrier. The phrasing twists into warnings, almost pleas. Scholars later debate whether the shift in tone reflects the hand of a different scribe, or a hidden theological tension that Byzantium fought to suppress. On the table beside the slab lies a small leather dossier. Inside is a history of the stone's troubled path. An anonymous donor, a coded note claiming the artifact was taken from beneath the northern apse of Hagia Sophia, and a final cryptic line, "One page is missing." The experts stare at the final photograph in the dossier. It shows the slab resting beside a hollow imprint in the soil where something once lay. Another piece, smaller, shaped like a rounded rectangle. The missing page. The curator overlays the image with the slab now before them. The edges match perfectly with the indentation. The gospel was never meant to be a single stone. It was a codex. Multiple sapphire leaves bound together by gold hinges long since torn away. The room grows colder as the scholars absorb the realization. Someone asks the question everyone is thinking. Who would carve sacred scripture into sapphire? And more importantly, why? Least of all in Byzantium, where the cost of a single palm-sized sapphire could fund a monastery for years. A slab this size would have bankrupted several noble families. Only an emperor could commission such a thing. Or someone above even him, someone with the authority to bypass earthly economics. The curator's gaze drifts back to the glowing inscription. Each letter dances like fireflies trapped under glass. The slab seems alive, restless, as though aware that human eyes have fallen on it again after more than a millennium underground. He whispers, almost involuntarily, "What were they trying to protect?" The epigrapher answers with a tremor in her voice. "Or what were they trying to hide?" A faint hum rises from the stone, so soft the scholars think it might be imagination. But the lights overhead flicker, just once, as if the stone has exhaled. Someone steps backward. Another begins recording every inch of the artifact. Cameras click. Scanners whir. Yet the scholars cannot shake the sense that they are intruding upon something sanctified, something not meant to be awakened. One of them recalls the donor's last message, "Do not let it be silenced again." Outside the vault, the wind howls through stone corridors. Inside, the slab glows brighter for a moment, illuminating dust motes swirling like constellations. The curator closes his eyes. For a fleeting second, the blue light feels warm, comforting, like the memory of a candlelit chapel. But when he opens them again, a final detail makes his breath catch. Near the lower right corner, faint but unmistakable, lies a symbol no catalog ever recorded. A small, circular seal, 3 lines radiating from a central point. Historians will later argue its meaning, but in this moment, everyone in the vault senses its purpose. It is a warning, or a signature, or perhaps an invitation. And beneath that symbol, barely visible, lies a thin crack, fresh, sharp-edged, impossible to date, as if the stone itself is preparing to open again, revealing something deeper still. A gospel that should not exist has resurfaced. And the greatest mystery is not how it survived, but why it returned now. Hadrian was no ordinary emperor. From the moment he ascended to power, he was a man who walked the tightrope between brilliance and obsession, between vision and obsession, a ruler whose mind seemed to stretch further than the boundaries of the empire he governed. Unlike some of his predecessors, who sought to expand Rome's borders with relentless conquest, Hadrian turned inward, captivated not by armies or lands, but by ideas, art, and the architecture of human thought. He traveled extensively, from the rocky cliffs of Britannia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, collecting not just knowledge and treasures, but experiences that shaped his worldview. Everywhere he went, he left traces of his curiosity, and everywhere he went, he observed, carefully, quietly, as if measuring not just the land but the hearts and minds of those who walked it. But beneath the cultivated elegance of his public persona, Hadrian harbored a private side few could comprehend. He was meticulous, almost compulsive, in his attention to detail, from the alignment of columns to the patterns of water in his fountains. Yet it was his obsession with secrecy, with the unknown, that truly defined him. He was fascinated by what lies beneath the surface, by what can be hidden in plain sight, by the idea that the mind itself could be a labyrinth as intricate as any villa or palace. He trusted few, confided less, and built layers of protection around his innermost thoughts. To Hadrian, the world itself was a puzzle, and he intended to control both the pieces and the solution. Hadrian's personal life mirrored his architectural endeavors. Deliberate, controlled, yet filled with unexpected depth. He was a lover of men and women alike, a patron of the arts, and a philosopher at heart. Letters and accounts suggest that he engaged deeply with poetry, rhetoric, and history, often debating with scholars for hours on the subtle nuances of morality, fate, and the weight of legacy. But these discussions, though public in some respects, hid a more intimate dialogue, conversations he held with himself through his designs, his writings, and his secret projects. Among these, the most enigmatic and perhaps the most deliberate was the hidden chamber he constructed at his villa, a room that would reflect the private fears and obsessions of the emperor in ways that no public document could reveal. The chamber was more than a hiding place. It was a reflection of Hadrian himself, a physical manifestation of his mind's complexity. Historians have speculated endlessly about its purpose, offering interpretations as varied as the artifacts found elsewhere in the villa. Some argue it was a sanctuary, a private retreat where Hadrian could escape the burdens of power, meditate, and commune with his thoughts. Others insist it was a repository for dangerous knowledge, containing scrolls or relics that challenged Roman orthodoxy, perhaps even evidence of secrets so potent that exposure could have destabilized the empire itself. And yet, no evidence has survived definitively to prove any theory, leaving the chamber suspended in the realm of speculation, a mirror reflecting the emperor's intellect and secrecy alike. What is indisputable, however, is the precision with which Hadrian approached the construction of his villa and, by extension, the chamber. Nothing was left to chance. Every curve of the corridors, every twist of a stairway, every reflection of light across marble floors was calculated, not merely for aesthetic appeal but for effect, for secrecy. There are accounts of rooms that seem to shift in perception depending on the time of day, of corridors that appear longer or shorter depending on the angle from which they are approached, of fountains that create the illusion of movement and sound where none exists. These architectural choices suggest that Hadrian understood the power of perception, of misdirection, of controlled revelation. And it is precisely in this context that the hidden chamber takes on its most haunting dimension. It was designed not merely to conceal, but to challenge, to guard, and to communicate in ways only Hadrian fully understood. Hadrian's obsession with secrecy extended beyond stone and mortar. He surrounded himself with a circle of confidants whose loyalty was tested daily, whose knowledge was carefully compartmentalized. Some accounts describe sudden disappearances, letters that vanished mid-delivery, and instructions so cryptic that even the most trusted advisors could scarcely comprehend them. The emperor's mind was a labyrinth, and he trusted few to navigate it safely. Scholars have noted that such measures were unusual even for rulers of his time, highlighting Hadrian's acute awareness of human ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. The hidden chamber, therefore, was more than a physical structure. It was a psychological safeguard, a way to exert control over knowledge, power, and legacy itself. Yet for all his meticulous planning, Hadrian was not without emotion. Letters to his lover Antinous, as well as reflections recorded by contemporaries, reveal a man capable of profound affection, deep sorrow, and intense longing. These emotions were not expressed in the public arena, where politics demanded calculation, but in private spaces, in architecture and personal correspondence, and perhaps within the secret chamber itself. Could the room have been a shrine to memory, grief, or loss? Could it have contained the remnants of his personal attachments, safely preserved from the public eye? The ambiguity only adds to its allure. In the end, Hadrian's secret obsession was neither entirely noble nor entirely sinister. It was human, an extension of a mind that sought to master the world, yet feared the vulnerabilities that mastery could not eliminate. It was in this tension, between genius and paranoia, between openness and concealment, that the hidden chamber found its purpose. It was a sanctuary and a puzzle, a vault and a mirror, a place where the emperor could confront his own mortality and the fragility of knowledge. And as centuries passed, as the empire rose and fell and the villa sank slowly into obscurity, the chamber remained untouched, waiting silently for those who might one day rediscover it. In the stillness of Hadrian's villa, where shadows cling to the walls like memory, one can almost hear the emperor's quiet insistence that some truths are not meant to be revealed lightly, that some knowledge must be curated, protected, and hidden until the world is ready, or until the right eyes arrive. The chamber, in its silence, beckons, it challenges, it dares, and it reminds us that Hadrian, more than any emperor before him, understood the power of secrecy, the weight of mystery, and the indelible mark one life can leave on the fabric of history. Long before the Byzantine world carved its empires into marble and gold, sapphire already carried a reputation that bordered on the divine. Ancient peoples looked upon the deep, shimmering blue of the stone and believed it was a fragment of the heavens themselves, a sliver of sky hardened into eternal crystal. It was impossible not to think this when holding a sapphire up to the light, watching it swallow shadows and release only a soft, celestial glow. Kings wore it to legitimize their rule. Priests wore it to declare their purity. But no one revered the stone more fiercely than the Byzantines, who believed sapphire did not simply resemble the heavens. It was the heavens, condensed into something that human hands could touch. In Christian iconography, blue was the color of divine truth, the cloak of the Virgin, the hue of revelation. A sapphire was said to strengthen the voice of the soul. Some mystics even believed that if a man stared into a flawless sapphire long enough, he could glimpse currents of divine wisdom moving beneath the surface like silent waves. The stone had power, symbolic, spiritual, and some whispered supernatural. Yet sapphire was extraordinarily rare in the ancient world. The largest deposits lay far east, in the lands of Kashmir and Sri Lanka, making the journey to Byzantium perilous, expensive, and often deadly. Only the wealthiest rulers could afford to possess the gem. Most people saw it only in mosaics or distant relics encased behind glass and gold. And so the idea of carving words, let alone scripture, into such a stone was unthinkable. To inscribe a sapphire was to challenge the natural world, for sapphire resisted every tool but the hardest diamond. This crystalline structure fought against intrusion. It was built to endure, not to be shaped. But the Byzantines were a people fascinated by endurance. They dreamed of crafting texts that would outlive fire, rot, war, and time. And sapphire, with its indestructibility and celestial symbolism, offered a promise no parchment could match. Whispers of a book of stones first appeared not in imperial records but in the journals of itinerant monks. These monks traveled long distances between monasteries, carrying tales and rumors as precious as relics. One such rumor spoke of a secret workshop in which artisans attempted to carve sacred verses into sapphire tablets, believing that divine truth deserved a vessel as eternal as God himself. Another rumor, more unsettling, claimed that these artisans were not craftsmen at all but mystics. Men who believed a message of enormous consequence had been revealed to them in a vision of blue light. They feared that parchment could be burned, scrolls could be hidden, and ink could be scraped away. Stone, however, could not be erased so easily. If the vision was true, if a message of divine origin had truly appeared in the form of radiant blue wisdom, then sapphire was the only medium worthy of containing it. For centuries, scholars dismissed these stories as symbolic exaggerations or pious legends, until fragments of unusually engraved sapphire began to surface across Anatolia. They were small pieces, no larger than a thumb, but each bearing faint traces of Greek letters. The letters were impossibly precise, cut with a skill that far surpassed normal stone engraving. They looked almost melted into the stone, as if light had burned them there rather than chisels. And the blue, always the same deep, mirrored blue, never faded, even under centuries of dust and decay. That consistency troubled historians. Natural sapphires varied widely in color, but these fragments seemed to match perfectly, as though they had once belonged to a single enormous piece. When modern gemologists examined them, they found microscopic grooves consistent with early medieval stonework, but also something else. A thin layer of residue clung to the crevices. It tested positive for oils used only in Byzantine anointing rituals. Lands outside Byzantium had no record of using such oils. The fragments were not foreign trinkets. They were unmistakably Byzantine in origin. Suddenly, the old rumors no longer felt like fantasies. The missing pieces of history began to suggest something immense. A codex carved not from parchment but from sapphire, pages of luminous blue inscribed with teachings unlike anything preserved in conventional scripture. A work that would require immense wealth, immense secrecy, and immense conviction. A project so ambitious it bordered on madness. Yet madness was not foreign to Constantinople. This was a city where emperors launched theological campaigns as fiercely as military ones. It was a city where truth and power were inseparable, where a single phrase could topple a patriarch, where visions and miracles were treated with the gravity of political treaties. In such a world, the idea of forging a sapphire gospel becomes less absurd. It becomes inevitable. If the truths inscribed within the stone contradicted imperial doctrine, then the slab's very existence would have been a threat. If the gospel suggested a different path to divinity, one found not through authority but through illumination, then the codex might have been considered too dangerous to reveal, and so it vanished, buried, hidden, sealed away beneath layers of war, fire, and fear. But not before its legend ignited a trail of stories spanning centuries. From tormented monks who claimed to hear the stone hum at night, to soldiers who believed it could glow in darkness, to merchants who smuggled fragments across seas, the Sapphire Codex lived in the shadows of human memory long after its pages disappeared from sight. And now, as modern scholars examine sapphire fragments and ancient manuscripts with tools far beyond anything Byzantium possessed, a pattern begins to emerge. A timeline, purpose, a message. The blue that defied empires may not have been a metaphor. It may have been a gospel, one carved in stone to survive the silence of 1,000 years. The rise of Cyrus the Great feels, even now, like something out of myth rather than history. His story begins not with the roar of armies or the proclamation of a king, but with a quiet birth in a remote corner of ancient Persia. An event so seemingly insignificant that no chronicler bothered to record the exact date. And yet, within a few decades, this child would transform from an unknown tribal prince into the architect of the first true world empire. But such meteoric ascents do not happen without guidance. No empire emerges from the desert simply because a single man wills it. Behind every victory, every strategic move, every improbable alliance, there are decisions so precise, so perfectly timed, that they seem to anticipate not just human behavior but the currents of history itself. It is here, in the gaps between recorded events, that the first undeniable traces of a silent influence begin to appear. Cyrus's early victories are described by Greek and Babylonian sources with a mixture of awe and confusion. He defeated kingdoms larger, wealthier, and far more experienced than his own. His armies moved with uncanny speed, appearing where enemies least expected them. His political maneuvers, turning rivals into allies and allies into loyal administrators, showed a depth of understanding rarely found in rulers of his time. This raises a haunting question. Who taught Cyrus these methods? Where did he learn diplomacy refined enough to win over conquered peoples? Who whispered to him when he decided to spare Croesus, the legendary king of Lydia, instead of executing him? These decisions were not impulsive, nor did they align with the typical attitudes of conquerors. They reflect a mind, or perhaps multiple minds, focused on shaping an empire that would last beyond one man's lifetime. Ancient Persian legend hints at advisors who walked beside the young lion, figures who instructed Cyrus in the ways of kingship. Yet no names survive. No inscriptions credit them. The official narrative suggests that Cyrus acted alone, guided only by divine favor or natural genius. But empires do not rise from genius alone. They rise from structure, planning, and a deep, coordinated understanding of human society. And Cyrus, still in his 20s, possessed such insight with an ease that borders on supernatural. One Babylonian clay cylinder, dated to the years just before Cyrus conquered the city, describes messengers from Persia who carried messages written in hands not of the king. Scholars debate this line fiercely. Some argue it refers to junior envoys. Others believe it suggests something more unsettling. A circle of advisors sending secret instructions, influencing political landscapes before Cyrus ever stepped onto the battlefield. Cyrus's conquest of Media is even more suspicious. The fall of King Astyages, Cyrus's grandfather, is traditionally explained by mutiny. Media's own generals supposedly switched sides mid-battle. A convenient story. Too convenient. Mutinies do not erupt spontaneously without organization. Soldiers do not abandon their king without persuasion, promises, or leverage. Something or someone engineered the shift. Compounding this mystery is the fact that Cyrus treated the Median nobles with surprising gentleness after victory. He absorbed their elites into his new government, gaining their loyalty rather than punishing rebellion. Such magnanimity was radical for the ancient world, where most conquerors relied on fear to secure their power. Cyrus instead ruled through trust, efficiency, and moral authority, methods that feel more like the product of deliberate ideological training than instinct. There is another anomaly. Throughout his campaigns, Cyrus consistently avoided unnecessary destruction. Cities that surrendered peacefully were left intact. Local customs were preserved rather than suppressed. When he entered Babylon, one of the wealthiest cities on earth, he performed no lavish purge or mass slaughter. Instead, he walked in as a liberator, a conqueror who freed captives, restored temples, and proclaimed himself the protector of tradition. Such behavior aligns eerily well with the teachings of the secret priestly sect whose rituals emphasized order, truth, and the preservation of cosmic balance. Scholars who study both Cyrus's policies and the splinter sect's coded writings note similarities too precise to ignore. The emphasis on justice over fear, the belief in moral governance, the prioritization of stability over domination. These are not typical instincts for a young conqueror shaped by tribal warfare. They resemble the doctrines of a hidden group that saw rulers not as absolute masters but as guardians of a greater universal order. Some historians propose that Cyrus encountered these teachings during his youth, perhaps through priests who saw potential in him. Others suggest a more dramatic possibility, that Cyrus did not simply learn from this secret group. He may have been their instrument, their chosen vessel, the first king molded directly by the Silent Brotherhood. If this is true, then the conquest of Media, Lydia, and Babylon were not just military expansions. Emperor Theophilos stood on the balcony of the Bucolian palace, the winter wind pulling at his crimson cloak as he gazed over the city that had worshipped him, feared him, and judged him in equal measure. The morning light washed across Constantinople like a river of gold, but Theophilos's eyes were fixed not on the gleaming domes of Hagia Sophia or the vibrant bustle of the harbor. His thoughts were buried far below, in the secret chambers where knowledge was hoarded like treasure and guarded like a curse. He was a man of contradictions, a paradox made flesh. The last great iconoclast emperor, known for shattering holy images yet privately obsessed with the mysterious and the divine. His court remembered him as a fierce military ruler, but behind closed doors he was a lover of poetry, science, and forbidden texts. He feared superstition but craved revelation. He denied the sanctity of icons but spent nights studying ancient manuscripts by lamplight, hunting truths he could never publicly acknowledge. In this fragile balance of faith and power, Theophilos cultivated something the empire had never seen before: a clandestine intellectual order known only to a select few. They were called the cryptoscribes, scholars chosen not for their loyalty to doctrine, but for their ability to keep secrets that could reshape heaven and earth. They worked in silence. They wrote in code. Their existence appeared nowhere in imperial records. And yet, their influence seeped through the cracks of history like smoke. Most served voluntarily, drawn to the emperor's urgent vision. Others were compelled into service, scholars whose brilliance bordered on heresy, men and women who had delved too deeply into mystical theology or ancient sciences. Under any other reign, they might have been imprisoned or exiled. Under Theophilos, they were given a single chance at redemption. Use their knowledge to serve a purpose they would never be permitted to understand fully. Each was sworn to secrecy under penalty of death, and more chillingly under penalty of erasure. In Byzantium, to be erased from records was to die a second, more permanent death. The cryptoscribes met in hidden rooms beneath the Magnora Palace, where torchlight flickered against marble walls and the air smelled of parchment, ink, and fear. Their tasks varied: translating obscure Syriac gospels, copying fragments of ancient Greek cosmology, analyzing strange symbols brought from distant monasteries. But there was one project whispered among them that none dared discuss openly. A project so sacred, so dangerous, that even speaking its rumored name felt like handling live flame. It began with a single fragment of stone brought to the emperor by a trembling monk who had traveled for days without rest. The monk claimed it came from a monastery in Bithynia, a place where the walls whispered at night and where the brothers refused to sleep alone. He carried the fragment wrapped in wool, terrified it might glow or speak or burn through the cloth. Theophilos did not laugh. He did not dismiss the monk as delusional. He studied the fragment for hours in silence. Carved into its sapphire surface were 4 Greek letters, so delicate, so impossibly perfect, that no ordinary tool could have made them. Under lamplight, they shimmered with a faint internal radiance. When Theophilos touched it, the stone pulsed with warmth. From that moment, the emperor changed. He summoned the brightest scholars of his court. He summoned gem-cutters capable of feats whispered about in guild legends. He summoned mystics who walked the thin line between revelation and insanity. And he commanded them to investigate the fragment, to trace its origin, to understand its purpose. Weeks turned to months. The cryptoscribes worked tirelessly, comparing the stone's script to every known gospel and apocryphal text. None matched perfectly, yet all seemed faintly echoed in its message. It was as if the stone sought to rewrite familiar truths into something older, purer, more luminous. One evening, after days of sleepless study, a scholar approached the emperor with fear in his eyes. "This is no fragment of ornament or reliquary," he whispered. "It is a leaf, a page." Theophilos asked the only question that mattered. "From what?" The scholar bowed his head and replied, "A codex, a gospel in stone." The emperor's breath stopped. He understood the implications instantly. Such a work, if real, would bypass scripture controlled by the church, challenge the authority of patriarchs, and threaten the fragile balance between imperial power and spiritual doctrine. A gospel carved into sapphire would survive fire, flood, rebellion, censorship. It would survive time itself. It would be unalterable, indestructible, eternal. Rumors say that Theophilos ordered the cryptoscribes to search for the remaining pages, even if it meant trespassing into forbidden monasteries, bribing hermits, or raiding ancient tombs. They traveled through the empire in secret, carrying wax-sealed messages, extracting confessions from dying monks, confiscating stones that glowed faintly when struck by sunlight. Some returned empty-handed. Others returned broken, shaken by what they had seen. A few did not return at all. One gem-cutter, renowned throughout the empire for engraving icons onto tiny gemstones, disappeared 2 days before completing a meticulous study of the sapphire fragment. His room was found immaculate, as if deliberately wiped clean. His tools remained on the table, arranged neatly beside an unfinished sketch of the stone's inscription. The emperor's agents found no sign of struggle, no tracks, no witnesses, only a faint, lingering smell of heated metal. The closer the cryptoscribes came to understanding the stone, the more dangerous their work became. Some believed the church was watching. Others suspected foreign spies. A few whispered that the stone itself did not wish to be decoded, that it possessed its own kind of will, a silent resistance against human hands. Yet Theophilos pressed on. He sensed that the codex carried teachings capable of shaping the empire's future. Teachings that could transform faith into something luminous and unbound. And perhaps teachings that could unseat emperors. The cryptoscribes realized they were racing against forces they could not name. Every clue raised new questions. Every translation deepened the mystery. And beneath the palace, in those torchlit chambers, they came to understand a truth as chilling as it was awe-inspiring. The sapphire fragment was only the beginning. Somewhere within the empire, hidden behind walls of secrecy, betrayal, and fear, the remaining pages of the codex waited. And the emperor, flawed, brilliant, desperate, was determined to find them before anyone else dared to try. Hadrian's genius was not limited to the marble halls, fountains, and gardens of his villa. It extended into the very blueprints of his creation. Architectural plans, sketches, and fragments of designs that survive suggest a mind consumed not only with beauty, but with precision, foresight, and, perhaps most intriguingly, secrecy. These plans were no ordinary maps of space. They were a language, a system of symbols and alignments that hinted at intentions far beyond mere construction. For Hadrian, every corridor, every staircase, every archway carried meaning. The villa itself became a canvas for intellectual exploration, a place where geometry, philosophy, and human perception intertwined. And woven within these patterns, scholars believe are clues pointing to the hidden chamber, a room whose existence is suggested not by legend alone, but by the very logic of the villa's design. The emperor's architectural language was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Certain symbols recur across floor mosaics, staircases, and decorative motifs. Small, deliberate anomalies that appear insignificant until viewed as part of a larger pattern. Some mosaics depict constellations in unusual alignment, as if the villa itself were oriented to celestial bodies, while others contain geometric sequences that suggest codes or messages intended for those who could decipher them. To Hadrian, the villa was not merely a home. It was a multi-layered puzzle, a three-dimensional manuscript whose pages were stone and water, and whose narrative was written in light and shadow. Each element had a purpose, each space could conceal meaning, and every hidden detail was part of a larger design meant to challenge, to protect, and perhaps to inspire awe. Among the most intriguing elements are the alignments between corridors and chambers. Careful measurement reveals that certain doorways, when approached from specific angles, frame views of sculptures or water features in ways that seem intentional, almost theatrical. These perspectives are not random. They suggest that Hadrian understood the psychology of perception, that he anticipated how observers would move through his villa and what they would notice or fail to notice. Some historians argue that this meticulous orchestration was a form of early visual encryption, a way to hide information in plain sight. A statue might point subtly toward a wall that hides a passage. A pool might reflect a ceiling in such a way as to reveal a pattern otherwise invisible. To navigate the villa successfully, one needed more than sight. One needed intuition, patience, and a mind willing to see the invisible. The surviving fragments of Hadrian's plans also hint at mechanisms. Doors that could slide, panels that could shift, hidden stairways embedded within walls. These mechanical devices, crafted with the precision of both art and engineering, suggest that Hadrian anticipated attempts to discover his secrets. Nothing in the villa's design was haphazard. Every feature could serve a dual purpose, functioning as both ornament and guardian of information. Even today, archaeologists debate the intended function of these mechanisms, because some seem to lead nowhere, while others open into spaces that remain largely unexplored. This duality, function and obfuscation, is central to understanding the emperor's intentions. Hadrian's use of symbols extends beyond geometry and mechanics. Certain motifs recur across his villa and in other constructions he commissioned across the empire. Patterns resembling keys, labyrinthine spirals, and stylized figures holding objects that have yet to be clearly identified. Scholars speculate that these symbols represent instructions, or perhaps warnings, meant to guide only those deemed worthy or trusted. The repetition of these motifs across vast spaces suggests a deliberate, calculated effort to encode messages into the very fabric of the villa. It is as if Hadrian sought to ensure that only a mind attuned to his thinking could perceive the hidden chamber's presence and purpose. Some clues are almost playful in their subtlety. A doorway might be slightly misaligned, noticeable only at a particular time of day when sunlight strikes the marble at an exact angle. A reflection in water might reveal a line or a break in the mosaic pattern, suggesting an entrance where none appears to exist. To the untrained eye, these details seem random, inconsequential. To someone attuned to Hadrian's methods, however, they become guideposts, breadcrumbs leading toward a deeper truth. The villa's design, in this sense, is both invitation and test, challenging observers to prove their patience, attention, and insight. The plans themselves, preserved in fragments and descriptions by later historians, reveal Hadrian's fascination with complexity. He was not content with a single secret chamber. Evidence suggests multiple hidden spaces, interconnected in ways that scholars are only beginning to imagine. Some passages may have served as decoys, designed to mislead intruders, while others could have offered access to the inner sanctum where the most sensitive items were kept. Hadrian's intent appears to have been dual, to protect and to provoke curiosity. He created a labyrinth not only of stone but of thought, a place where physical exploration mirrors intellectual challenge. Yet even with these clues, the villa remains maddeningly elusive. The plans are incomplete, many symbols remain undeciphered, and the precise location of the chamber has yet to be confirmed. It is this ambiguity that sustains the villa's power over the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts alike. Each generation returns with new tools, new theories, and new hope of unraveling the emperor's mystery. Yet each leaves with questions as pressing as those they arrived with. The villa's architectural language, in its elegance and complexity, resists final interpretation. It is a conversation across time, a silent dialogue between Hadrian and anyone bold enough to seek him out. It is also worth noting that Hadrian's architectural genius was intimately connected with his personal obsessions. He sought harmony between art, philosophy, and human experience, yet he also feared exposure, betrayal, and the loss of control. The hidden chamber, encoded within the villa's intricate plans, may represent a confluence of these desires, a place of beauty and knowledge, yet fortified against intrusion. The very act of hiding something within such a grand space underscores the emperor's awareness of human ambition and the fragility of trust. Every step, every turn, every reflection may have been calculated to test loyalty, discretion, and insight. Ultimately, Hadrian's plans remind us that architecture can be more than functional. It can be a vessel for intellect, emotion, and secrecy. His villa was a living manuscript, a work of art that encoded the values, fears, and ambitions of a man who sought to outlast time itself. Within this complex web of design, patterns, and symbols, the hidden chamber exists not merely as a physical space but as an idea, a testament to a mind that understood the power of concealment and the enduring allure of the unknown. For anyone who ventures into Hadrian's villa, the plans are a silent companion, whispering that discovery requires both intellect and intuition, patience and perception, and above all, a willingness to see what others cannot. The myths speak in fragments, broken pieces of memory carried through thousands of years, reshaped by storytellers, softened by time, but never entirely forgotten. Across the Andes, from the glaciers of the Cordillera Blanca to the shadowed valleys of the Altiplano, there exists a shared whisper among cultures that never met, never traded, never conquered one another. A whisper of the age when the sky changed. It begins as a simple phrase in old Quechua songs, when the stars fell out of place. In Aymara oral traditions, it becomes, the year the heavens twisted like a serpent. And among remote highland families, guardians of stories never written down, the phrase is even more eerie. The night the world forgot the sky. The researcher first encountered these phrases during interviews with elders in isolated villages. They spoke them quietly, as if the words themselves carried power. No one described it as metaphor. It was always told as memory. Deep ancestral memory, passed down like a wound. They spoke of a time before their ancestors were people. A time when the sky rearranged itself in a single generation, leaving the world terrified and transformed. At first, the researcher chalked it up to myth. Civilizations often explain ancient catastrophes through celestial metaphors. Volcanoes become angry gods. Earthquakes become battles between sky spirits. But as the researcher gathered more stories, something changed. The details were too consistent, too precise. Villages separated by mountain ranges and centuries described the same sequence of events. A period of strange lights in the sky, a sudden shift in constellations, a long darkness, then the return of the stars but not in their original places. This was not poetry. This was a record, and it aligned disturbingly well with geological evidence. Around 12,000 years ago, Earth experienced rapid climatic upheaval, the end of the last ice age, the Younger Dryas impact period, possible cometary debris entering the atmosphere. To most of the world, these remain theories. But to the people of the Andes, they may have witnessed it directly. The researcher pored over astronomical simulations, matching them against the temple alignments. Something extraordinary emerged. The so-called flaw in the alignment, the slight deviation noted in all 13 temples, corresponded almost perfectly to the position of key constellations during the catastrophic sky shift hypothesized by researchers studying prehistoric climate anomalies. In other words, the temples were aligned not to the sky of their own time, but to the sky before the Great Change. That realization struck like cold lightning. It suggested the temple builders were not merely observers of the heavens. They were preserving a memory, a map of the sky that existed before the world was reshaped. A memory etched into stone, immune to the erosion of time, war, and empire. The researcher cross-referenced ancient myths across continents. Shockingly, cultures around the world spoke of a similar moment. Australian Aboriginal legends recount the turning of the sky. Native American oral histories describe the night the stars danced. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey features carvings interpreted by some scholars as records of a cosmic impact. Everywhere, humanity seems to remember a night when the heavens altered in ways that defied comprehension. But in the Andes, something more happened. The cultures here treated the event not as a disaster, but as a message, a warning, a reminder that the sky is not fixed, that the universe is not indifferent, that great cycles of destruction and renewal are woven into existence itself. It began to dawn on the researcher that the 13 temples might form a system far more complex than astronomical observation. They were memory repositories. They encoded a worldview in which celestial change mirrored human transformation. The temple rituals, those involving breath, darkness, and sound, might have been methods for aligning human consciousness with cosmic cycles. When the sky changes, so must humanity, and perhaps those changes were expected to return. As the researchers studied the alignments more closely, another troubling pattern emerged. The temples did not just map the constellations as they were 12,000 years ago. They also tracked precessional drift, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. This meant the builders understood a concept modern astronomy only formalized in the last few centuries. They knew that the sky shifts over time, and they encoded those movements with extraordinary precision. One alignment in particular sent a chill through the researcher's spine. A long, narrow stone corridor in one of the high-altitude sites pointed directly at a constellation that is only now returning to visibility after thousands of years below the southern horizon. It suggested the temples were designed not only to remember the past, but to anticipate the future, to mark the moment when the sky would begin to resemble the old world again, to signal the reopening of a cycle. The researcher closed their eyes and imagined that ancient night, the sky tearing open with light, fire streaking across the heavens, constellations shifting like living things, entire communities gathering in the mountains, watching the cosmos rewrite itself. Fear, awe, silence, and then a decision to build monuments not to gods but to knowledge, to build temples that would whisper to the future. The deeper the researcher dug into the myths, the less they resembled superstition and the more they resembled encoded scientific memory. In a symbolic language the modern world has forgotten how to read. And if the sky is indeed shifting again, if the same stellar patterns are beginning to reappear after 12 millennia, then the 13 temples may not be relics at all. They may be clocks, warning beacons, or blueprints for survival. And the researcher, standing between myth and science, understood with chilling clarity. The ancients were not telling stories. They were trying to say something urgent, something humanity has ignored for 12,000 years. The sky changed once, and it will change again. The deeper the artisans carved and the more the scholars translated, the more a troubling realization took shape. What lay inscribed on the sapphire slabs did not simply reinterpret scripture. It diverged from it in ways that made even seasoned theologians tremble. The text was familiar enough to feel sacred, yet strange enough to feel dangerous, like a melody whose final note had been shifted just slightly off-key, awakening an entirely different emotion in the listener. The first passages hinted at a vision of creation unlike anything in the canonical Gospels. Instead of beginning with the spoken word, the sapphire inscriptions described creation as a burst of living radiance, a divine pulse that filled the universe before any form or law or soul existed. This radiance was called Sophia Fotini, the light of wisdom, not personified, not gendered, but a universal awareness that permeated all things. The scholars who read this line exchanged uneasy glances. The concept was familiar enough to evoke whispers of early Christian mysticism, but bold enough to undermine the rigid theological structures built over centuries. In this gospel, divine wisdom was not restricted to prophets, priests, or emperors. It was not mediated through icons or relics or rituals. It flowed everywhere, like light filtering through a stained glass window, different in color to each observer, but unchanged in essence. That idea alone would have unsettled the empire. But the rest went even further. The sapphire text described a teacher, unnamed, undefined, who spoke in parables unfamiliar to any known scripture. This teacher, described not as a figure of flesh but as a voice clothed in blue fire, revealed that every human soul was a shard of that first radiance, a spark of the original divine light. Salvation, the text implied, was not granted through obedience to earthly authorities, but awakened through recognition of one's inner illumination. To the scholars, this was heresy wrapped in poetry. If divinity dwelled in every person equally, what purpose did emperors serve? What role remained for patriarchs, councils, or clergy? What use were the countless rituals, laws, and hierarchies that upheld the empire's spiritual order? The passages seemed written with a kind of serene defiance, as if the authors understood they would be condemned and carved their insights into sapphire precisely because they believed them worth preserving beyond fear. Some lines glowed brighter than others, their meaning clear even to those unfamiliar with theology. The kingdom is not above nor below, but within the chamber of the heart. No altar is needed when the soul itself is a temple. Seek not the throne of heaven. Seek the light that already dwells in the marrow of your being. These phrases struck at the heart of Byzantine power. They denied the emperor's divine right. They dismissed the patriarch's necessity as mediator. They made every believer a vessel of revelation, which meant no institution could claim ownership of truth. And then came the passage that chilled the scholars most deeply. Beware those who trade in fear, for they seek to hide the light. They will declare the truth forbidden. They will call the radiant path a lie. Yet the stone remembers. The last line repeated across several pages, carved with microscopic precision, each repetition smaller than the last, as if spiraling inward toward some hidden meaning. The stone remembers. The phrase haunted the cryptoscribes. Some believed it was metaphorical. Others insisted it implied the codex held additional layers, possibly encoded in the sapphire's crystalline structure. One scholar proposed, dangerously, that the gospel was reactive, that light or heat might reveal secondary inscriptions invisible to the naked eye. But it was the theological implications that terrified the emperor most. If the Sapphire Codex spread, even as rumor, it could spark a movement the empire could not control. Theophilos's iconoclastic policies, already controversial, would look insignificant compared to this text's radical ideas. Both icon worshippers and iconoclasts would see him as a threat. Rival factions could use the gospel to justify rebellion. One scholar warned the emperor that the text could create a third path, a spiritual doctrine outside imperial or ecclesiastical authority, a path where power held no divine sanction unless it aligned with inner illumination. Theophilos dismissed him publicly but summoned him privately that night. What would become of an empire if such teachings spread? The emperor asked. The scholar hesitated, then answered honestly, it would not survive. After that, the emperor's demeanor shifted. His curiosity did not wane, but it twisted into something darker, an obsession mingled with dread. He demanded translations of every line, cross-examined scholars through sleepless nights, and kept the unfinished pages hidden under his personal guard. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. One fragment described a future where the empire of gold collapses under its own shadow, replaced not by another empire but by a dawn of wandering sparks. A poetic image that could be interpreted as a prophecy of fragmentation, of a world in which no central authority reigned. Another stated, when kings claim the mantle of heaven, the light withdraws. To an emperor who styled himself God's chosen sovereign, this line landed like an arrow. But there was one teaching, carved near the very center of the codex, that terrified everyone who read it. It claimed that divine revelation belonged not to councils or books or rulers, but to the individual. It said every soul contained a unique pattern of light, a pathway only that person could walk. Salvation was not collective, it was intimate, inward, unavoidable. This teaching was revolutionary, dangerous, and entirely incompatible with the empire's need for obedience. The bishop overseeing the translations begged Theophilos to destroy the codex, warning that even possessing it constituted spiritual treason. But the emperor refused. Something about the sapphire pages held him captive. Some mixture of fear, fascination, and faint hope. Perhaps he sensed that beneath its threat to his authority lay a truth he desperately wanted to understand. Perhaps he feared that destroying the codex would provoke divine wrath. Or perhaps he simply knew this. Once a truth is carved into sapphire, it becomes almost impossible to bury. The forbidden theology within the sapphire slabs continued to unravel, page by page, illuminating and unsettling in equal measure. And while the emperor struggled to decide the codex's fate, the scholars who worked in the shadows began to notice something ominous. Something that suggested the gospel itself was incomplete. There were references to a final chapter. A chapter no one had yet found. A chapter that, according to the inscriptions, revealed the origin of the light. The missing chapter became the most terrifying mystery of all. The royal road stretched across the empire like a ribbon of intent, carefully measured, expertly engineered, and unmistakably purposeful. It was more than stone and packed earth. It was a declaration of connection, a spine of communication holding together a realm so vast that most rulers would have struggled simply to map it. Yet Persia did not struggle. It thrived. Messages that once took months to cross kingdoms now traveled in days. Orders could be issued from Susa and felt in Lydia before the ink dried. Armies could mobilize, resources could be moved, rebellions could be quelled. All with a precision that feels astonishing even by modern standards. But the deeper one looks into the royal road's design, the harder it becomes to believe that it was built solely for the convenience of bureaucracy or commerce. Its layout is too perfect, its relay stations too specifically placed, its surveillance mechanisms too subtle yet too effective. It functions not just as a road but as a network, an invisible web. A system designed for more than governance. A system designed for watching. The Herodotian description of Persian messengers. The legendary "nothing stops them." Not snow, not rain, not heat, not night. Has been romanticized over time. But beneath the poetry lies something chilling. These messengers did not merely deliver news. They carried information in a way that suggests training, discipline, and a level of discretion far beyond that of ordinary couriers. Their travel logs were not casual notes. They were reports coded, formulaic, and surprisingly uniform across thousands of miles. At each stop along the road, innkeepers and local administrators kept records of who passed, when, and carrying what type of seal. This was ostensibly for logistical purposes, but in practice it created a perfect, real-time map of movement across the empire. Every departure and arrival, every delay, every deviation from expected timing was observed. Such a system could only have functioned effectively if overseen by individuals who understood the value of information not merely as data, but as power. It is here that the whisper of the Brotherhood begins to surface again. Some satrapal archives include mentions of silent couriers, officials who traveled without insignia, whose movements were exempt from ordinary logging. These men answered to no governor, carried no visible credentials, and moved with authority that even high-ranking aristocrats feared to question. When they arrived at a station, doors opened. When they requested information, records were produced. When they moved on, no one wrote their names. Their presence is acknowledged only indirectly, buried in lines like, "A special traveler passed today," or "The silent one inspected the route." Scholars have long struggled to identify these mysterious figures. Some claimed they were spies. Others thought they were priests. But the consistency of these references across the empire indicates an organized network. One that operated with a clarity of purpose and a level of secrecy that surpasses any known official role. This network used the royal road as its lifeline. In one archive, a cracked wooden tablet records a strange instruction. "Prepare the inner chamber for observation." The phrase appears abruptly, without explanation. Yet buried within the same region's administrative logs are repeated references to a house of listening, a structure built with unusually thick walls and narrow slits overlooking the main road. Historians once assumed this was a guard post. But why then does it appear in the account books of the priestly class, not the military? The road, it seems, was not only watched, it watched back. In ruins along the old route, archaeologists have found small chambers adjacent to the relay stations. Rooms too small for lodging, too plain for storage, and too hidden for casual visitors. Their placement suggests a design meant for observation, not utility. From these vantage points, travelers could be watched without realizing it. Every merchant, soldier, diplomat, and messenger became part of a flowing stream of intelligence. And intelligence was exactly what the Brotherhood would have needed. If the Silent Brotherhood truly existed, if they shaped the empire's administrative structure and influenced its kings, then the Royal Road was their greatest tool. A mechanism to gather, filter, and direct information to the inner circle. A system that made them omnipresent without ever revealing their identity. The most revealing clue comes from a letter preserved in the Persepolis fortification tablets. Written by a mid-level administrator to his superior, it reads, "The Watchers have passed. Their seal bore the mark of the inner eye. We made no record." The phrase inner eye appears nowhere else in official Persian documents, but it echoes the symbol carved into the side of the mysterious tablet from Section 2. A symbol scholars could not fully explain. If this letter is authentic, it means that the anonymous symbol was used as a secret credential on the empire's most important transportation artery, a glyph recognized by officials across thousands of kilometers. How could a symbol without official meaning be so widely understood? Because its meaning did not belong to the public empire. It belonged to the secret one. The speed at which information traveled allowed the hidden order to remain informed of everything. Troop movements, grain shortages, political tensions, religious unrest. They knew which satraps were loyal, which were corrupt, which were planning rebellion. They could intervene before problems became crises. They could guide kings with intelligence far more comprehensive than any ruler had possessed before. Some historians attribute Persia's long internal stability to its efficient administration. But administration alone cannot explain it. Many empires had well-structured governments and still fell quickly. Persia endured because it saw. It watched. It anticipated. The Royal Road was the empire's visible artery, but behind it pulsed an invisible pulse, one controlled by those who understood that knowledge, more than armies, determined destiny. And as the empire expanded, the Brotherhood's reach expanded with it, carried not by soldiers or priests, but by silent travelers whose footsteps left no trace in history. Yet their presence can still be felt, faintly, like the echo of hoofbeats fading into the distance along a road that once connected an empire, but may also have connected a conspiracy. The legends of the drowned kingdoms do not appear on modern maps. No archaeologist marks them on satellite charts. No government survey lists their boundaries. And yet, among the people who live in the shadow of the Andes, these kingdoms are spoken of with a certainty that challenges the very definition of myth. They are not stories, the elders say. They are memories, memories of cities swallowed not by time, but by water. The researcher first heard these stories near the shores of Lake Titicaca, a body of water so vast and still that it feels less like a lake and more like a mirror set between the mountains. Local fishermen spoke of ruins glimpsed beneath the surface on rare days when the light hit just right. They described pillars, stairways, and geometric platforms buried deep in the cold, blue depths. One old fisherman said his grandfather warned him never to cast nets near the lake's center, for the spirits of the drowned city do not like to be disturbed. The researcher dismissed the claims as folklore until they saw it for themselves. While aboard a small reed boat at sunset, the wind died, the water smoothed to glass, and the lake revealed its secret. Rows of massive stones resting far below, aligned too perfectly to be natural. The shapes were orderly, intentional, rectangular foundations, terraces, even what seemed like the outline of a courtyard. The light shimmered, the vision blurred, and within seconds the stones slipped back into obscurity. But the moment was enough to break the boundary between myth and possibility. The Andean plateau holds countless stories of submerged civilizations. To the north, villagers spoke of a kingdom beneath Lake Pupo, now nearly vanished after decades of drought. They told of a once great city that sank in a single night after a violent sky event, described as flames raining from above. To the south, the Uru people whispered of an even older city, a place built when the mountains were lower, swallowed when the earth took back its waters. The consistency of these stories, spread across vast distances and multiple cultures, was striking. Could entire cities, entire cultures, have existed and vanished before the rise of the Inca, before even the earliest known Andean societies? Geologists propose that massive changes struck the Andean region at the end of the last ice age. Melting glaciers triggered sudden floods. Earthquakes reshaped valleys in hours. Volcanic eruptions darkened skies for months. It was a world in upheaval, a world where cities could be swallowed whole. Modern researchers seldom connect these geological events with human settlements so ancient that they predate conventional timelines. Yet local myths insist that people lived through these transformations and that their cities were real, their destruction witnessed. The researcher followed these legends further, trekking into isolated areas where the air thins to a whisper and the land becomes an endless horizon of stone. In one remote village, an elder described how, long ago, a mother temple once stood high in the mountains, higher than any city had the right to be. It was built, she said, by a people who understood the movement of the sky better than the movement of time. But when the great waters rose, they abandoned their high sanctum and retreated deeper into the mountains, leaving behind structures that were never meant to be rediscovered. When the researcher asked where this mother temple was, the elder pointed not to a visible mountain, but to a vague region of peaks lost among clouds. "It is there," she whispered, "above even the eagles. A place the sun touches before the world wakes. A place too old for names." The significance of her claim struck hard. This mother temple was older than every ruin known in the Andes. Older than Tiwanaku. Older than the earliest humans believed to have settled these regions. Could the 13 temples trace their lineage to a time before the floods? Could they represent the surviving outposts of a culture erased almost entirely by rising waters? The more the researcher explored, the more evidence emerged. In a steep ravine, they found stone blocks bearing the same geometric carvings seen in the subterranean chamber, spirals and serpent-like patterns. Yet the blocks were partially submerged in a meltwater stream that could not have existed when they were carved. Their placement indicated they once formed part of a structure now long eroded or buried by shifting terrain. In another valley, they met a herder who claimed he sometimes heard chanting coming from beneath the lake during certain lunar cycles. He believed the sound came from spirits trapped in underwater temples. When the researcher asked if he ever tried to investigate, he shook his head violently. "The lake remembers," he said, "and it remembers who should not return." Such statements might sound superstitious, yet sonar scans conducted over the last decade reveal curiously regular formations beneath Titicaca and Popo, steps, walls, platforms, consistent with engineered structures. Archaeologists acknowledge these features but avoid speculation. The depth and cold make excavation nearly impossible. But for the researcher, these scans aligned perfectly with the stories. Temples swallowed by water, rituals abandoned in haste, knowledge drowned but not forgotten. The idea of pre-Inca civilizations is not controversial. But the idea of civilizations advanced enough to build monumental temples before the rise of agriculture? Before the stabilization of climate? Before even the creation of known mythology? That borders on heresy in academic circles. And yet, the evidence whispered otherwise. As the researcher followed the pattern of submerged ruins across the plateau, a chilling realization formed. The 13 temples were not isolated anomalies. They were the survivors. The ones built high enough, strong enough, or intentionally enough to withstand the cataclysmic changes that swallowed their sister cities. If some temples once stood at lower elevations, near lakes, rivers, fertile valleys, those would have been the first to disappear beneath rising waters. The mother temple mentioned by the elders might have been the last refuge, built high above the drowning kingdoms as a bastion of ancient knowledge, a sanctuary, or a warning tower. The researcher sat on a boulder overlooking Titicaca one evening, watching the sun sink behind jagged peaks. The lake glowed gold, then red, then black. Somewhere beneath that surface, beneath that cold darkness, were the answers. Answers drowned 12 millennia ago. But the mountains had not forgotten. The legends persisted. The temples remained. And somewhere between water and stone, between what was lost and what was preserved, lay the truth of the drowned kingdoms. A truth pointing unmistakably toward the existence of a civilization older than history itself. a civilization that built temples not to worship gods, but to communicate something the waters buried but could not erase. The 13 temples were only the beginning. The real story lay beneath the lakes, in the ruins waiting to be seen again. And the question that now haunted the researcher was simple, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. If the drowned kingdoms were warnings, who or what were they warning us about? The hidden passageways of Hadrian's villa are as enigmatic as the emperor himself. Long corridors twist unpredictably, staircases climb and descend in disorienting patterns, and doors appear to vanish depending on the angle of approach. For those who wander the villa without guidance, the experience is both mesmerizing and unnerving, as if the architecture itself is alive, responding to the observer's curiosity or hesitation. Scholars have long debated whether these passageways were designed primarily for practical purposes, such as servant movement and private access, or whether they were deliberate instruments of concealment, meant to mislead, test, or protect. Evidence strongly suggests the latter, and it is here, within these labyrinthine arteries, that the first tangible hints of the secret chamber emerge. Some corridors, once thought to be ordinary service routes, reveal subtler complexities upon close inspection. Slight depressions in the floor, irregularities in the masonry, or unexpected echoes in the walls suggest intentional anomalies. A seemingly ordinary door may conceal a sliding panel, leading to a staircase embedded within the wall, accessible only to those who know its mechanism. Pools and fountains placed nearby create reflections that can either reveal or obscure entrances, depending on the observer's perspective. It is an architecture designed to manipulate perception, creating uncertainty and awe in equal measure. Every step in these passageways feels calculated, as if Hadrian anticipated not only movement but thought, testing whether visitors would notice anomalies or dismiss them as inconsequential. The villa's subterranean network is particularly intriguing. Beneath the visible layers of halls and gardens lies a hidden skeleton of tunnels and chambers, some of which remain unexplored to this day. Archaeological surveys have detected cavities beneath the villa's foundations, irregular spaces that resist easy explanation. These hidden areas were likely constructed for a dual purpose: secrecy and protection. Some scholars suggest that the emperor may have stored sensitive documents, personal relics, or even experimental artifacts within these hidden depths, safeguarding them from both political rivals and casual discovery. Others propose a more esoteric function, speculating that the tunnels were designed to guide ritualistic or symbolic journeys, echoing Hadrian's fascination with prophecy, philosophy, and spiritual symbolism. The interplay between architecture and psychology is particularly evident in the villa's hidden corridors. Certain passageways create optical illusions, bending light and perspective to make spaces appear larger, smaller, or differently oriented than they are. Mosaics and frescoes along the walls often contain irregularities that only make sense when viewed from specific vantage points, guiding the observer's attention or hiding subtle cues. A small carving, a shifted tile, or the angle of a column could indicate a hidden entrance, but only to those who understand the emperor's language of design. In this way, the villa becomes more than a physical structure. It becomes a test of perception, intellect, and intuition, a puzzle layered upon a puzzle, with the secret chamber as the ultimate reward. Some of the most tantalizing clues about the chamber's location are found near the villa's water features. Fountains, pools, and artificial lakes were not merely decorative. They were instruments of concealment and misdirection. Reflections could obscure entrances or hint at hidden alignments, while the sound of flowing water could mask footsteps or whispers. Certain pools, when approached at specific times of day, align with mosaics or statues in ways that suggest a pathway or mechanism. Modern studies of the villa's hydraulics reveal an extraordinary level of engineering, one that allows water to flow in precise patterns, creating both beauty and secrecy simultaneously. It is possible that the hidden chamber was intentionally placed in proximity to such features, both for protection and as a means of guiding those deemed worthy to its threshold. The psychological dimension of the villa extends even further. The stone felt wrong in the researcher's hands. Not wrong in the sense of danger or decay, but wrong in a way that made the skin prickle and the heartbeat stumble for half a second. Felt alive. warm even in the freezing air of the plateau, vibrating even though the ground beneath their feet did not move, as if the stone itself were holding on to something, remembering something. For weeks, the researcher had been studying samples taken, with great reluctance from local guides, from the 13 temple sites. And the deeper they looked, the stranger the stones became, not because of what was carved into them, but because of what they were. The blocks contained unusual concentrations of magnetite, quartz, and in some places, trace amounts of minerals normally found far from this region. It was as if the builders had deliberately fused multiple geological sources into a single architectural material. And yet the cuts were too perfect to be accidental. Under magnification, the surfaces revealed microscopic striations resembling the smoothness of melted stone, a process requiring temperatures impossible for ancient cultures to achieve. But the most curious property was invisible. It was audible. The stones sang. Late one night, while testing resonance frequencies inside one of the outer chambers, the researcher tapped a block with a metal rod. The resulting tone was not the dull thud of normal stone. It was a clear, ringing hum that lasted nearly 8 seconds. Different blocks produced different notes, yet all harmonized perfectly. It was intentional. It had to be. The architecture was built like a giant instrument, an instrument capable of manipulating not just sound, but the human brain itself. Because when the researcher stood in the center of the chamber and hummed a low tone, the stone answered back. Not immediately, not like an echo, but like a response, rising, merging, swirling around the room as if the frequencies were being shaped, directed, and amplified. The walls of the temple behaved like tuning forks on a scale humanity no longer understands. The researcher recorded the phenomenon and replayed it through a frequency analyzer. The data was chilling. The temple stones amplified frequencies between 40 and 70 Hz, known today to induce altered states of consciousness, deep introspection, or even trance-like experiences. The ancients weren't guessing. They knew exactly what they were doing. Then came the second discovery, far more unsettling. One afternoon, while examining a stone slab removed from a collapsed section, the researcher placed it near a compass. The needle twitched, then rotated slowly until it pointed not north, but toward the slab. The stone was magnetically aligned. Not randomly, precisely. Each stone face was charged with a different polarity, arranged so that entire walls formed coherent magnetic patterns. These patterns matched faint geometric lines found carved into the obsidian mirrors, the same spirals seen in ritual alcoves underground. The temples were built not just with stone, but with memory encoded into the stone itself. Modern science knows quartz can store information through vibrational states. Magnetite can record magnetic shifts over millennia. Together, they form the basis of early data storage experiments. But these temples predated modern understanding by thousands of years. Had the temple builders been using stone as a memory system? The ancient Andean myths suddenly made sense. Stories of stones that remember voices, rock that listens, mountains that speak to those who know the words. They were not metaphors. They were descriptions of a technology so ancient that its purpose became myth as languages changed. The researcher began testing small fragments using electromagnetic scans. What emerged was baffling. Faint, rhythmic fluctuations, a kind of internal pattern, microscopic but consistent. Not random noise. Not geological static. Something like a recording. Something like a pulse. When translated into sound, the pattern resembled a slow, repetitive beat, like a heartbeat at rest. Could have been natural mineral resonance, but the regularity was too precise, too deliberate, almost biological. The findings raised a terrifying question. Were the temples designed to interact with their environment? To respond to ritual chants and breathing? To record events? To wake up when activated? It seemed impossible, yet there it was in the data. Then the third discovery shattered the boundary between science and myth entirely. In the deepest chamber of the fourth temple, one partially collapsed and sealed for centuries, the researcher found a series of grooves carved into the floor. When traced, they formed a circular pattern, a labyrinth of lines converging at a central point. A map? A calendar? A ritual diagram? None fit. Only when the researcher compared the grooves to the magnetic scans of the stone walls did the truth click into place. The grooves were a schematic, a representation of how the temple processed sound and magnetic energy, an internal blueprint of the structure's function. The ancients were not building temples. They were building machines, massive, stone-based instruments that used vibration, magnetism, and resonance to alter human perception. And the deepest chambers? They weren't designed to house offerings. They were designed to house people. People who entered willingly. People seeking transformation. People who were guided, maybe by the sisterhood, through carefully choreographed rituals. The researcher realized with growing horror that the temples were interactive. Not passive ruins, but systems awaiting activation. And then came the final confirmation. On a windswept evening, as daylight bled from the plateau, the researcher performed one last test. They stood between two towering megaliths, both rich in magnetite, and whispered a single sustained note. The stones vibrated. The air trembled. The frequency amplified until it felt like the ground itself began to hum. And then the hum shifted, not like an echo, not like a vibration, but like a reply, a distinct, deliberate modulation rising in response, as if the temple recognized the tone, processed it, and answered back with its own voice. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't animal. It was something else. Something ancient. Something aware. The researcher staggered backward, heart pounding. The realization crashed over them. These stones were never just stones. They were memory. They were machinery. They were participants in rituals designed to open the human mind to something vast and incomprehensible. And if the temples could still respond, it meant they had not finished their purpose. It meant they were waiting. For what? For whom? The answer hung in the cold mountain air, vibrating like a whisper. The temples remember. And soon, they will speak again. They called them the night pilgrims. Men and women who walked willingly into darkness, fasting until their thoughts sharpened like blades, climbing paths so steep and narrow that a single misstep meant death. They came from valleys, highland farms, fishing villages, desert oases, people of every kind. Yet once they joined the pilgrimage, they walked as one body, one breath, one purpose. The researcher first learned of these pilgrims through a 16th century account from a Spanish chronicler who described ghostly processions, moving silently across ridges long before dawn. The locals said these travelers were not Inca, nor farmers, nor warriors. They were something older, something sacred. Their destination. The 13 temples whose locations were whispered, never written. No one alive remembers their journey. But the landscape does. The researcher followed faint trails in the mountains. Some etched into rock, others lost beneath centuries of erosion. These paths cut across impossible terrain. Narrow ledges hugging cliffs, switchbacks carved into slopes of crumbling shale, spirals around steep hills that created dizzying loops. This was not random wandering. The routes were intentional, each turn designed to push the body to exhaustion and the mind into unfamiliar territory. By tracing these trails with GPS, the researcher uncovered a revelation. The pilgrimage routes formed a geometric pattern spanning over 600 miles. A vast, deliberate design. Lines that converged on the 13 temples like threads tightening around the heart of a labyrinth. The paths resembled a giant symbol carved across the Andes. A symbol no known culture used, yet one echoed in the temple carvings and obsidian mirrors. The realization was staggering. These trails weren't just footpaths. They were part of the system. The pilgrimage itself was an act of activation. Along the trail, the researcher encountered stones arranged in ways impossible to attribute to chance. Some emitted distinct tones when struck. Others aligned perfectly with solstice shadows. At one particular ledge, they found 3 singing stones. Thin slabs positioned so that wind passing through them produced flute-like tones. Old villagers said the night pilgrims believed the wind carried messages from the mountain spirits, guiding their steps. The idea sounded poetic until the researcher experienced it. Standing between those stones as the wind rose, the air trembling with haunting, harmonic notes. Not random, not chaotic. A sequence almost like an ancient melody. Did the pilgrims walk to the rhythm of the mountains? Halfway along the reconstructed pilgrimage route lay a plateau known locally as the waiting place. Here, the researcher found remnants of fire pits and circular depressions in the ground, sites where pilgrims likely rested during their fasts. But the extraordinary feature was the ring of stones around the plateau's edge. Each stone pointed toward a different temple. When the moon rose, shadows on these stones formed an intricate looping pattern around the circle, an astronomical clock tracking the sky's slow movement through seasons. Standing at its center, the researcher felt a jolt of understanding. The pilgrims weren't just travelers. They were participants in a celestial ritual. Their journey mirrored the movement of the heavens. As the stars rotated across the sky, the pilgrims rotated across the Andes. The deeper the researcher followed the trail, the more it became clear that the pilgrimage was not physically necessary. It was psychologically transformative. Certain segments of the trail forced the body into hypoxic states, triggering lightheadedness and heightened perception. Some paths trapped the echo of a traveler's footsteps, creating a ghostly doubling effect. Other stretches were so silent that one's heartbeat became loud enough to hear through the ears, a phenomenon the pilgrims interpreted as the mountain speaking inside the body. These were not coincidences. The trails were engineered experiences. The pilgrims' exhaustion, hunger, disorientation, and sensory distortion were part of the ritual. By the time they reached a temple, they were prepared. Mind stripped raw, senses sharpened, vulnerability heightened. Ready for the next stage. The temple rituals of breath, sound, and shadow. At one remote ridge, the researcher discovered a carved stone slab etched with spirals identical to those found in the underground chambers. Elders claimed this was the threshold stone. Pilgrims would place their hands upon it and breathe in a specific pattern before continuing. The idea seemed like superstition, until the researcher placed their own palm on the stone. A deep vibration pulsed through it, subtle, steady, almost like a slow heartbeat. It was the same vibration detected in the temple stones. This meant the pilgrimage path was not separate from the temples. It was the first layer of the system. The night pilgrims themselves are described in legends with awe and fear. Some said they could see visions while awake. Others said they walked without leaving footprints. One story claimed they carried bowls of obsidian dust, scattering it along the trails so others might follow the path of the dreaming stones. The researcher initially dismissed these claims, until laboratory analysis of soil from several trail segments revealed microscopic flakes of polished obsidian embedded in the ground. Obsidian does not naturally appear in those regions. Someone placed it there, deliberately, long ago. At the end of the pilgrimage, at the foot of a massive temple entrance carved into the mountain itself, the researcher found something extraordinary. Faint footprints fossilized in ancient volcanic ash, footprints belonging to adults and children. Children. Night pilgrims did not journey alone. These were not isolated seekers. This was a generational ceremony, a transfer of knowledge through experience rather than language. Suddenly, the geometric pattern across the Andes made sense. The entire landscape was a ritual machine. The trails were wires. The pilgrims were the current. The temples were the nodes where energy converged. And the sisterhood? They were the technicians ensuring the system ran as designed. The final revelation came when the researcher plotted the entire reconstructed pilgrimage route onto an ancient sky map. Perfect match. The paths mirrored a forgotten constellation, one no longer visible in the modern night sky. One seen only before the sky changed. The night pilgrims were walking the shape of the ancient heavens. Their journey was a reenactment of cosmic memory. And if the temples were built to track cycles that repeat over millennia, then the night pilgrims were preparing humanity for a cycle that is returning. One step at a time, one star at a time, one temple at a time. The story of the satrap who vanished begins not with a grand rebellion or a bloody betrayal, but with a single letter, simple, unadorned, written in steady script on a thin strip of parchment discovered centuries later among the ruins of an administrative archive. The letter bears no signature, only an official seal belonging to the satrapy of Lydia. Its contents are haunting in their restraint. a report expressing concerns about quiet influences in the court of the king, and a suggestion that certain counselors speak with authority beyond their station. The letter's tone is calm, but beneath it vibrates something dangerous. An awareness, perhaps, that the writer was stepping onto forbidden ground. Historians believe the author was Artafernes the Younger, a mid-ranking satrap who inherited his position from a long line of administrators. He was known for his fairness, his meticulous record-keeping, and his loyalty to the empire. But something during his tenure disturbed him deeply enough to risk writing that letter. Something he saw or heard that made him question the balance of power in the royal court. The document ends abruptly, almost unnervingly. I fear that what moves unseen moves also without limit. Days after this letter was recorded, Artafernes disappears from all surviving administrative logs. No mention of reassignment, no record of punishment, no note of death. His name simply evaporates. This is highly unusual. The Achaemenid administration was famously thorough. Even disgraced satraps, traitors, and rebels were documented at the time of their removal. But Artafernes, known, respected, and well-established, vanishes as though his existence was erased intentionally. The disappearance might have been dismissed as accident or coincidence had it not been accompanied by other irregularities in the same region. A sudden tightening of communication channels, strange gaps in the correspondences of nearby governors, a series of unexplained delays in courier schedules, and 2 sealed records from Sarda stamped with the words, "Internal Resolution." No further inquiry. Such stamps appear only in rare cases, typically when matters touch the personal authority of the king, or when something threatens the ideological integrity of the state. But what could a satrap in Lydia have uncovered that demanded such total silence? One fragment from a Greek historian hints at a scandal involving advisors without titles, who traveled between royal courts commanding unusual respect. Another Babylonian tablet describes priests of the inner flame visiting Western satrapies for purposes unknown. These accounts, though vague and biased, align disturbingly well with the patterns already uncovered, the Brotherhood's silent presence, always moving just out of reach of official narratives. If Artafernes encountered these advisors, if he recognized their influence and attempted to report it, he may have triggered a response from the very group he sought to expose. But what exactly did he witness? Some speculate that he intercepted messages written in the Brotherhood's coded language, phrases similar to those found in temple inscriptions and elite councils. Others suggest he observed meetings between satrapal officials and mysterious envoys carrying no royal insignia. Still others believe he saw what few were meant to see, the Brotherhood intervening directly in administrative affairs, manipulating decisions that should have belonged solely to the satrap. There is one more chilling detail. In the excavation of a large estate near where Artafernes once governed, archaeologists found a wooden chest buried beneath a collapsed storeroom. Inside were dozens of tablets and parchments, personal notes, drafts of reports, and fragments of correspondence. Many were charred, as if someone had tried to destroy them, but one survived well enough to read. It contains a short, hurried passage written in a hand believed to be Artafernes's. They speak softly and do not announce their rank. I asked one of their names. He said names do not matter in their service. They watch the courts, the roads, the armies. They know before we know. They decide before others speak. And their eyes. There is something in their eyes. The writing ends mid-sentence, smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. What had frightened him so deeply? The scribbles on this fragment match the tone of the earlier letter. A man trying to articulate something he does not fully understand, something that moves outside the boundaries of ordinary political intrigue. A man realizing he stands on the edge of a truth that others have died to keep hidden. After Artafernes disappears, the region undergoes a quiet but noticeable shift. Officials previously aligned with him are reassigned. His allies lose influence. A new satrap arrives, one with impeccable connections to the priesthood. His first decree emphasizes loyalty not only to the king but to the keepers of order, a phrase that appears nowhere else in regional documents. It is as if the Brotherhood replaced Artafernes with someone more understanding. In the following years, smaller anomalies ripple outward. Letters arrive in Susa stamped with unfamiliar seals. Travel permissions are granted for unnamed officials moving through the western provinces. Religious festivals subtly alter their rituals. Priests in Lydia begin referencing the guardians of truth in their sermons. Though this phrase was not part of local doctrinal tradition, it is difficult to ignore the pattern. A satrap saw too much. A satrap asked the wrong questions. A satrap disappeared. And in the vacuum left behind, the Brotherhood tightened its grip. The official histories remain silent. They speak only of kings, generals, taxes, and wars. But in the gaps, in the absences, in the documents that should exist but do not, the outline of something invisible emerges. A shape made of silence. A power defined not by presence, but by erasure. The satrap who vanished may not have changed history on his own, but his disappearance reveals something far more important. It is evidence not only of the Brotherhood's existence, but of its methods. Subtle, precise, and merciless when threatened. The empire endured for centuries. Many would say it endured because of its structure, its armies, its wealth. But perhaps it endured because there were those who watched everything, erased what needed erasing, and ensured that no one, not even a loyal satrap, could interfere with the silent machinery that kept Persia's heart beating. They called it the breath between worlds, a place where the living and the dead, the past and the present, the mountains and the sky all touched for a brief, trembling moment. But to truly understand what the temples meant, the researcher had to leave the scientific instruments behind and listen instead to the oldest storytellers of the Andes, the Quechua and Aymara elders whose memories run deeper than written history. They were the last people who still spoke to the mountains as if the mountains could speak back. The researchers' first encounter with these ancestral voices happened in a stone hut perched at the edge of a windswept valley. Inside, warmed by a small fire, sat an Aymara elder with eyes milky from age but sharp with an inner clarity. When the researcher asked about the temples, she did not speak of stone or carvings or chambers. She said only, "They echo. They echo because the ones before us still live inside them." It took time. Hours of patient listening, slow translation, cups of bitter coca tea, for her meaning to reveal itself. The Andean worldview does not separate the living from the dead the way modern society does. Ancestors are not gone. They remain present in mountains, rivers, clouds, and wind. The past is alive, not as metaphor, but as literal presence. And the temples, especially the forbidden ones, were not monuments. They were conduits, places where the echo of the ancestors could be heard. The elder recounted stories passed through generations, stories that modern historians dismiss as myth, but which the researcher now recognized as fragments of something deeper. Spirits whispering during storms. Stones vibrating when the stars reappeared after long absence. Pilgrims hearing voices guiding them through fog. Dreams that taught wisdom rather than fear. And always, the same phrase, "The mountains remember." The researcher traveled from village to village, seeking more elders who remembered the old stories. Their words varied in detail but aligned in essence. One Quechua storyteller described how her grandmother taught her to place her ear against certain stones during the solstice. "You will hear them breathing," she said. "You will hear the old ones singing." Another spoke of dreams his great-grandfather experienced. Vivid visions of past lives, glimpses of ancient temples, and warnings of a sky that changed color in a single night. "These dreams," he explained, "come from the stones, not from the mind." A third elder, a quiet farmer whose family had lived in a high-altitude village for centuries, described an unsettling experience. As a child, he heard a low humming echoing across the valley at dusk. Too rhythmic to be wind, too deep to be animal. He asked his father what it was. His father only said, "That is the voice of those who built before us. They speak when the world forgets." The more the researcher listened, the more striking the pattern became. These weren't myths. They were observations. Observations passed orally through thousands of years, describing phenomena linked directly to the temple's resonant structures, mineral compositions, and geographic placements. It was as if the ancient builders intended the temples to be acoustic memory vaults, resonant containers capturing frequencies, voices, perhaps even brainwave patterns of ritual participants. If stone could store sound, could it store consciousness? The elders certainly believed so. One woman, nearly 100 years old, described how her ancestors taught her to enter a trance inside certain caves. She said that in silence, one could meet those who walked before you. When the researcher asked what she meant, she smiled softly. You meet them as thoughts not your own. The idea aligned eerily with the researcher's previous findings. Resonant frequencies capable of inducing altered brain states. Sensory deprivation chambers designed to dismantle linear perception. Magnetite-rich stones capable of influencing neural activity. The temples were not caves of worship. They were transmission chambers. The elders seemed to know this instinctively. They spoke of hearing without ears and seeing without eyes. They described visions of ancestors appearing as shadows, flickers in the corner of the eye, or voices in the wind that answered questions before they were asked. One particularly enigmatic elder, the last surviving member of a long line of ritual keepers, spoke of a phenomenon that chilled the researcher. When the sky is wrong, the stones speak louder. He went on to explain that during certain astronomical events, people across the Andes reported the same dreams. Temples glowing from within, wind carrying mournful chants, mountains vibrating as if waking from a long sleep. These dreams intensified whenever major cosmic alignments approached. The researcher began compiling these reports, and a disturbing correlation emerged. Periods of unusual ancestral echo matched the precessional cycle. The slow wobble of the Earth's axis that the builders had tracked with uncanny precision. The elders weren't describing ghosts. They were describing a reactivation. As if the temples were designed to awaken during specific celestial conditions returning in the present era. The researcher experienced something similar one night while camping near an ancient trail. As the wind rushed through the valley, a faint harmonic vibration rose from the stones. It wasn't random. It was patterned, musical, familiar. Then something happened the researcher could never fully explain. The vibrations formed what sounded like a word. A single syllable. Soft, ancient. A name they had never heard, yet somehow recognized. The mountains answered. The researcher lay awake the entire night. Shaken. Rational explanations. Wind, fatigue, altitude. Fought against a deeper, visceral truth. Something in the stone was speaking, or remembering, or awakening. The next morning, an elder approached the camp and said, "You heard them, didn't you? That means you are close." "Close to what?" the researcher asked. The elder looked toward the horizon, toward the peaks standing silent and immense. "To what they left for us," he said, "and to what returns when the sky changes again." The realization settled over the researcher like cold mist. The echo of the ancestors was not just memory. It was a message, a warning, and perhaps a call. A call the temples had waited millennia for anyone to finally hear. They were the greatest empire the Andes had ever seen. Masters of agriculture, engineering, road building, administration. Creators of stonework so precise it baffled the world for centuries. And yet, standing before the oldest ruins in their own territory, the Inca whispered the same confession again and again. "We did not build these." For the researcher, this admission was the turning point. A moment when history fractured, and the truth slipped through the cracks. The Inca ruled over millions, stretching from Ecuador to Chile, weaving a complex civilization across mountains that break lesser empires. They constructed Machu Picchu, Coricancha, Sacsayhuaman. And yet, even at their height, they arrived at certain sites. Massive cyclopean walls, impossible megaliths, underground chambers, and hesitated. Not because they didn't understand the architecture, because they respected it, feared it, revered it. As the researcher pored over early chronicles, a disturbing pattern emerged. Inca rulers incorporated many sacred sites into their empire, but not these. The oldest, strangest temples were left untouched or simply repurposed around the edges. The Inca built adjacent structures, added ceremonial plazas, placed offerings, but never altered the core. They dared not interfere with something they believed was already complete, perfect, and dangerous if disturbed. The researcher traveled to Cusco, to the ruins of a site the Inca considered too sacred to modify. There, among winding corridors and impossibly fitted stones, the researcher found carved steps leading toward a sealed chamber. The walls carried no Inca motifs, only spirals and symbols identical to those inside the subterranean temple the researcher had descended weeks earlier. The guide accompanying them, a descendant of Inca nobility, spoke words that lingered long after the tour ended. My ancestors believed these temples were alive and sleeping. The Inca inherited something they could not explain, and so they mythologized it. In their cosmology, the older temples belonged to the Napa Machu, the ancient ones who came before the sun had fully risen in the world. But unlike many cultures that dismissed their predecessors, the Inca held them in profound respect. They believed these ancient ones lived in perfect harmony with the stars, building temples to mirror the constellations, to record the cycles of the cosmos, and to communicate with forces beyond the material world. This reverence explains something the researcher had long found puzzling: why the Inca built so many ceremonial complexes just outside older structures instead of atop them, as conquering empires usually do. They weren't afraid of the ruins. They were afraid of misusing them. One chronicler wrote of an Inca priest who refused to sleep inside a pre-Inca chamber because the stones whisper too loudly. Another described a ritual master who warned the emperor never to conduct certain ceremonies in those older temples, saying they were meant for the sky, not for men. When the researcher traced these accounts to their sources, they found references to strange phenomena experienced by Inca priests. Rooms where echoes answered in unfamiliar tones, stones that warmed under moonlight, walls that vibrated during solstices, dreams so vivid they felt like messages from another mind. One particularly chilling account described a night during the reign of Pachacuti, the greatest Inca ruler, when a group of priests attempted to perform a ritual inside one of the ancient chambers. They emerged terrified, refusing to speak of what they saw. The emperor decreed the chamber sealed indefinitely. It remained untouched for centuries until the Spanish tore it open, only to declare it empty. Empty, yet strangely resonant. The Spanish had described echoes that lingered too long, shadows that felt wrong, and a sense of being watched. They dismissed it all as superstition or tricks of architecture. But the researcher now knew better. The Inca encountered an ancient technology. They recognized its power, and they decided to adapt rather than understand. One Inca elder told the researcher something profound during a quiet evening overlooking the sacred valley. "We built what we needed. The ancients built what they feared." The statement haunted the researcher through sleepless nights. What had the ancients feared? What had they tried to warn future civilizations about? Looking across the old sites, the researcher noticed a startling pattern. The more ancient the temple, the deeper it went underground. The Inca, by contrast, built toward the sky, terraces, towers, sun pillars. Their temples welcomed light, but the older ones sheltered shadows. They hid chambers beneath chambers, building downward instead of upward, as though the knowledge they guarded was meant to be buried, protected, hidden from those who were not ready. Another strange detail surfaced in the Inca chronicles. Certain pre-Inca sites were declared malquisca, taboo, forbidden, dangerous, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because they changed the mind of those who stay too long. A royal chronicler wrote that Inca messengers, after passing one such site, reported dreams of voices speaking in unknown tongues, visions of ancient skies, and an overwhelming urge to walk toward certain mountains without explanation. These were the same symptoms the researcher had begun to feel near the active temples. The Inca recognized the temple's effects. They feared their influence, so they kept their distance, honoring them without touching their core. But the most startling evidence came from an archaeological excavation near Ollantaytambo. Beneath the Inca terraces, researchers discovered remains of an older structure, one clearly built to align with a constellation no longer visible. The Inca had used the area as a ceremonial platform, but the older layer suggested something else: a gathering site for the architect caste, or perhaps a training ground for the sisterhood. This revealed the truth the researcher had been chasing without words. The Inca encountered a civilization whose mastery exceeded theirs, not through war or conquest, but through psychoacoustic engineering, astronomical precision, and altered states of consciousness. The Inca inherited these temples, but they never understood them. Not fully, not truly, and that fear, that respect shaped their empire. The researcher knew then, if even the Inca, the greatest empire of the Andes, could not grasp the temple's purpose, yet sensed their danger, then the knowledge those structures guard must be immense, ancient, and possibly catastrophic if misinterpreted. The Inca stood at the threshold of a truth too large for their time, so they stepped back. Now, centuries later, the researcher found themselves standing at that same threshold. And this time, the truth was no longer patient. Long after the flames of Persepolis cooled, long after Alexander's army marched west with plundered gold and broken pride, a team of builders and laborers returned to the charred ruins, not to rebuild, but to clear the wreckage. They worked in silence, sweeping away memories swept aside by war. Yet beneath the ashes, beneath the blackened beams and crumbling walls, lay something that was never meant to be found. Buried deep under layers of collapsed corridors, sealed chambers, and fallen stone slabs, a cluster of manuscripts survived, hidden not by chance, but by design. Their survival defied logic. Fire devours papyrus and parchment easily. Even clay tablets crack under intense heat. Yet these fragments endured. Archaeologists centuries later would find them sealed inside a recess slabbed with polished limestone. An architectural feature with no clear purpose, too narrow for storage, too awkward for ritual. It appeared more like a secret vault, accessible only through a crawlspace now clogged with debris. Had the chamber existed to protect these manuscripts, or to hide them? The fragments themselves are puzzling. Some are written on thin leather treated with a resin-like substance that made them more fire-resistant than ordinary scrolls. Others are clay tablets with nearly microscopic writing carved so finely it required specialized tools and specialized training to inscribe. Their survival feels intentional, as though someone placed them there moments, or perhaps years, before the flames consumed Persepolis. One parchment fragment contains a sentence repeated 3 times in slightly different forms, as if someone practiced phrasing, "What is unseen does not perish, for truth outlives the flame." The repetition is odd, reflecting not a scribe copying a text, but a writer thinking, refining, preparing. It suggests personal reflection, not official doctrine. Another fragment is far stranger. It mentions the 7th pillar and the guardians of the inner balance, echoing phrases found earlier in temple inscriptions and the cryptic writings tied to the splinter sect. Yet here, the tone is different, less confident, more anxious. It warns, when the circle breaks, the flame scatters, perhaps referencing the Brotherhood schism. But the most remarkable piece is a tablet coated in soot but still legible. It describes a meeting, possibly the last of its kind, between members of the Brotherhood. They speak of the invader who sees too clearly, presumably Alexander. They debate whether to stay and defend their knowledge or flee eastward, taking their teachings where Macedonian influence would never reach. The tablet ends abruptly with, "We scatter as smoke scatters, but the fire within us remains." The metaphor of scattering recurs repeatedly across the fragments. It suggests a conscious decision. The Brotherhood knew Persepolis would fall. They knew their physical center was doomed. They knew Alexander's approach could not be halted. And so, they prepared not to fight but to vanish. Some chose to hide knowledge. Some chose to carry it away. Some chose to burn it themselves rather than let it fall into foreign hands. A deep sense of urgency permeates the surviving texts. One line reads, "Let not the outsider learn the path of watchers." Another states, "When truth is hunted, it must walk in many bodies." Scholars interpret this as symbolic, but what if it reflected a literal strategy? The dispersal of members across the empire's remnants, into priesthoods, temples, academies, and foreign courts, like seeds cast into the wind. Archaeological evidence suggests that the chamber holding these manuscripts was sealed from within. The slab was pulled into place from the inside, leaving no mechanism to reopen it. Whoever hid the texts may have never escaped. Their final act may have been preserving what they knew, even at the cost of their own lives. But among the fragments lies a more haunting clue. A map, if it can be called that, drawn not as geography but as a network of lines branching outward from Persepolis like rays from a sun. Along these lines are symbols representing fire temples, administrative centers, and remote regions extending into Bactria, Sogdia, and beyond. A few symbols match those used in earlier Brotherhood inscriptions. It appears to depict the diaspora of knowledge, the path taken by those who escaped before Alexander reached the city. The existence of such a map suggests the Brotherhood was not destroyed by fire, but scattered, its members carrying small pieces of a greater whole across the ancient world. Yet the most enigmatic fragment is a scrap of leather containing a single sentence. The seventh remains hidden. No context, no explanation, no additional markings. Some scholars interpret this as referencing a surviving member of the original inner circle. Others see it as symbolic, a statement that the core truth behind the Brotherhood endured despite the destruction of its physical center. Whatever its meaning, the phrase has an unsettling resonance. It suggests that even after Alexander burned Persepolis to the ground, the Brotherhood's most vital secret endured. The surviving manuscripts are tantalizingly incomplete, like chapters torn from a book centuries before anyone could read them. But taken together, they reveal a picture of a group that understood the power of knowledge and the necessity of protecting it at all costs. One cannot help imagining the final moments before the chamber was sealed. Perhaps a handful of initiates gathered in the dim light, hurriedly placing their most precious writings into the recess. Perhaps they whispered a final oath, a final prayer, a final promise. Perhaps they heard the shouts of soldiers outside, the crackling of flames, the collapse of ceilings. Perhaps one among them, the last, pulled the stone slab into place, knowing he would not walk out again. The manuscripts remained entombed for centuries, silent echoes of a world that tried to erase them. When discovered, they did not answer every question. Instead, they opened new ones, questions about the Brotherhood's survival, its dispersion, and its influence on the cultures that inherited Persia's fractured legacy. If the Brotherhood was truly scattered, then their ideas, subtle, resilient, and woven into ritual, law, and philosophy, would resurface far beyond the boundaries of the fallen empire. The fire of Persepolis destroyed the palace. It destroyed the archives. It destroyed a dynasty. But the fire could not destroy everything. What was hidden outlasted the flames. The story should have ended at 13. Every legend, every map, every ritual pointed to 13 temples, no more, no less. But buried deep in the earliest colonial diaries and whispered in trembling tones by the oldest Aymara storytellers was a darker, stranger rumor. There was once a 14th temple, and it vanished. Not ruined, not collapsed, vanished. The researcher first stumbled upon this forbidden tale in a crumbling notebook written by a Spanish surveyor in 1547. Most of the entries were mundane, a record of livestock, weather patterns, and failed attempts to establish mining routes. But halfway through the notebook, his handwriting changed, shaky, frantic. In those trembling pages, he spoke of a temple of impossible geometry, perched along the spine of a remote ridge. He wrote of stairways that led upward but somehow descended, of walls that seemed to tilt inward and outward simultaneously, depending on where one stood, of stones that felt warm in winter and icy in the sun. And then the final entry: "The temple is gone. I swear upon my soul it was here yesterday." After that sentence, the ink streaked downward in a jagged line. The rest of the page was blank. At first, the researcher considered the possibility of hallucination. High altitude, thin air, a frightened foreigner seeing patterns in shadows. But then they found a second source, this time from an Inca administrative scribe writing decades before the Spanish arrived. The scribe listed sacred sites across the empire. Beside one entry he wrote, "Yache Wasi, House of Knowing. Now lost to the mountain. Lost to the mountain. Not destroyed. Not abandoned. Lost." Still skeptical, the researcher traveled to the region described in both accounts. A jagged, wind-scorched ridge where lightning carved scars across the rock, and the air felt unnaturally charged. Local guides refused to go anywhere near it. They insisted the ridge was cursed, a place where mountains shift their bones. But the researcher pressed forward alone. As they climbed, something strange happened. The GPS malfunctioned, spinning in circles, unable to determine direction. Cameras flickered. A compass needle jerked wildly, swinging toward the mountain only to reverse seconds later. The ridge radiated something unnatural. When the researcher reached the summit, they found nothing but scattered stones, natural-looking, unremarkable. Yet something in the air felt wrong. Too still, too observant. The silence was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something holding its breath. They walked in slow circles, looking for any sign of ruins. Nothing. But as the sun lowered, the shadows lengthened, and then the impossible happened. Lines appeared, faint at first, then clearer, carved edges emerging where there had been none. A contour of a wall, corner, terrace, not physical stone, a shadow of stone, as if the remains of the temple were bleeding through, visible only in a narrow slice of fading light. The researcher reached out, trembling, and touched the nearest outline. Their fingers passed through empty air. The temple wasn't gone. It wasn't destroyed. It existed, but not fully in this space. A shiver raced up their spine. Something about the geometry echoed the sealed 13th temple, circuits of stone and unseen energy fields. But this place felt different. This place felt unstable. A memory surfaced, something an elder had told them near Lake Titicaca. There were not always 13. One was hidden, not by time but by choice, because it saw too much. Saw too much? The researcher dug deeper into the oral histories. One version said the 14th temple could walk with the sky. Another said it stepped sideways when the stars fell out of place. A third claimed it refused to remain in a world that forgot. This was not metaphor. Ancient Andean cultures understood the sky intimately. They tracked precession, solstices, equinoxes, planetary cycles. They might have known that spacetime is not as rigid as it appears, that vibration, resonance, and geometry can alter perception and perhaps even location. The 14th temple may have been built differently. Maybe it was a prototype. Maybe it was unstable. Maybe it was dangerous. One terrifying possibility took shape. The temple didn't vanish. It shifted, out of alignment, out of phase, out of the physical world. Perhaps it slipped into a state where it could only be seen under certain conditions. Sunset, solstice, the moment between light and dark. Or perhaps it existed all the time, but only partially overlapped with the world humanity inhabits. If the ancients were experimenting with mind-altering architecture, temples as machines, chambers as resonant systems, they might have pushed too far in this one place. A temple designed not only to change consciousness, but to change reality. The researcher became obsessed. They returned at different hours, different angles, different moon phases. Each time, the shadows painted a different portion of the lost structure. Walls, doorways, terraces, a spiral descent leading to a center that did not exist in the physical rock. On a moonless night, the researcher heard something unsettling. A faint echo beneath the ridge, a rhythmic pulse, too regular to be natural, too deep to be human. The vanished temple wasn't silent. It was humming, like the sealed 13th temple. A chilling realization dawned. The 13th and 14th temples were connected. One sealed. One slipped away. Perhaps the ancients closed one and hid the other because together, they formed a system too powerful to allow free access. A system that recorded the sky before the Great Change. A system that predicted the next shift. A system that might activate when the stars realigned. The researcher's final discovery came from a rare colonial manuscript hidden in a monastery basement. Inside, written in trembling Latin, was the testimony of a monk who had spoken with surviving villagers after the 14th temple disappeared. His final note was almost unreadable. They say the temple went where the sky will go again, and when it returns, nothing will hide it. The researcher closed the manuscript slowly, heart pounding. If the temple vanished because of a cosmic event 12,000 years ago, if it is tied to the cycles the architect cast mapped, if it is beginning to appear again, then the world may be nearing the same conditions that once tore the ancient sky apart. And when the 14th temple returns fully, when shadow becomes stone again, its purpose will no longer be hidden. It will be activated. And nothing the mountains, the sisterhood, or time itself did to conceal it will stop what comes next. They found it by accident, or perhaps it found them. A hollow tower of stone rising from a barren ridge, neither fully temple nor fully ruin, built from interlocking blocks so smooth they seemed poured rather than carved. The locals refused to approach it. Travelers avoided it instinctively. Birds circled wide around its peak, never perching upon it. They called it El Oráculo del Aliento, the Oracle of Breath. The structure stood alone, distant from the other temples, as if exiled. The researcher realized why the moment they stepped inside. The interior was not a chamber. It was a lung, a spiraling passageway wound upward like the coils of a giant stone serpent. The walls were alive with thousands of narrow slits, vent-like openings carved with surgical precision. Even without wind, the temple exhaled a faint, ghostly tone, like the last breath of something ancient slumbering beneath the mountain. And when the wind did blow, the temple sang. The first gust came as the researcher climbed the spiral. A faint vibration trembled through the stone, brushing their skin like an invisible hand. Then a tone emerged, low, resonant, mournful. It echoed through the chamber, growing deeper and more layered. The sound was not random. It was structured, musical, purposeful. It was almost aware. The researcher froze, listening. The stone vents were arranged in ascending frequencies. Each slit caught a specific angle of wind, turning the entire structure into a vast aerophone, an instrument older than any flute, horn, or conch ever crafted. Yet this was more than music. The sound didn't merely fill the ear, it filled the mind. The vibrations penetrated bone. They pulsed in the chest. They seemed to alter the rhythm of breath itself. The temple was teaching the visitor how to breathe. The ancients had encoded an instruction, not in words, not in symbols, but in frequency. At certain pitches, the sound slowed the heartbeat. At others, it sharpened awareness. Some tones induced a floating sensation, as if the body and mind began to separate. Modern neuroscience calls this entrainment. Ancient people called it communion. The deeper the researcher climbed, the stranger the effects. The air felt thick yet invigorating, as if infused with microscopic electricity. Their vision sharpened. Their thoughts became crystal clear, each idea forming with startling precision. It was meditation without effort, trance without drugs, revelation without thought. At the halfway point, the spiral widened into a circular chamber illuminated by narrow beams of sunlight filtered through the carved vents. Dust motes danced in the golden rays, swirling like slow-moving galaxies. In the center of the chamber stood a stone basin, smooth as obsidian, filled not with water but with air so cold it shimmered faintly. The researcher leaned close. Their breath deepened involuntarily. And then something impossible happened. A whisper, not words, not sound, but a sensation, moved through their lungs. A message carried not through hearing, but through breathing. A sensation of memory that wasn't theirs. Stone corridors, torchlight, a procession of veiled figures chanting in spiraling rhythms. Hands raised in unison as the wind began to sing. A great shift in the sky. A moment of awe, terror, and understanding. The researcher staggered back. Was it hallucination, hypoxia, or had their body absorbed something the temple was still transmitting? Breath as information, breath as memory, breath as prophecy. The more they studied the oracle, the clearer its function became. Unlike the other temples, built for resonance or isolation, this one was built to control airflow with precision bordering on miraculous engineering. Each vent was angled to catch seasonal winds. Each chamber shaped to amplify specific frequencies. Each turn in the spiral designed to synchronize human breath with the breath of the earth. The ancients believed breath was the bridge between worlds, the thread connecting body to spirit, spirit to cosmos. And in this temple, the breath became something more, a code, a key, a method of accessing states of consciousness modern science barely understands. While studying the outer slits, the researcher noticed something extraordinary. Tiny carvings, barely visible, framed each vent. Spirals, lines, geometric forms identical to those seen in underground chambers. But these symbols weren't decorative. They were instructions. Every vent corresponded to a ritual breathing pattern. Every pattern corresponded to a stage of initiation. Every stage led to the next chamber. The architect cast had built a literal ladder of breath. As the researcher climbed toward the uppermost chamber, the wind intensified, rushing through the slits with a complex harmony of tones. The sound pressed against their skull, not painfully but insistently, as though urging them to match their breath to its rhythm. And when they did, something clicked inside their mind. A sensation of expansion, a sudden clarity, presence not external but internal, awakening. The oracle wasn't simply a place to induce altered states. It was a place to transmit knowledge. Knowledge encoded in breath, in vibration, in the movement of air through stone. Then came the discovery that changed everything. At the very top of the spiral, in the final chamber, the researcher found a carved panel etched with symbols unlike any found in the other temples. It depicted a series of human figures seated in meditation, surrounded by flowing lines representing wind. Above them, a set of stars glowed. Arranged in the same ancient constellation the architect cast had tracked across all 13 temples. Below the figures was a single inscription in archaic glyphs. When the sky turns, the breath returns. The implication was staggering. The oracle was built as a training site, a place where ritualists learned to use breath to access the temple network, a place where generations prepared themselves for the next cosmic cycle, the next sky change. The researcher felt a cold shock run through them. All the temples, the humming stones, the sealed door, the vanished 14th, were pieces of the same system, a system built to prepare human consciousness for something vast. Something cyclical, something returning. As the wind rose again, swirling through the oracle in a haunting, harmonic scream, the researcher understood. This temple wasn't just singing. It was warning, a breath before the storm, a whisper before the awakening, a call that had waited 12,000 years for someone to hear it again. And now the mountains were breathing once more. Darkness is not merely the absence of light. In the ancient temples of the Andes, darkness was the teacher, and those who entered it were expected to return changed, if they returned at all. For weeks, the researcher had studied the upper structures, the resonant stones, the pilgrimage paths, but nothing prepared them for what awaited beneath the ground. Deep in the hidden arteries of the temples, in chambers built not for worship, but for unmaking, they found the descent by accident. A narrow corridor hidden behind a tilted slab, sealed by centuries of dust. When the stone was gently moved aside, stale air burst forth, cold, metallic, untouched by sunlight for untold ages. The tunnel beyond was impossibly narrow, forcing the researcher to crawl on hands and knees before the space opened into a vertical shaft. And then came the realization. This wasn't a ruin. It was a system designed to lead human beings into the deepest silence they had ever known. The first chamber was a spherical room carved so smoothly it appeared polished. There were no carvings, no symbols, no offerings. Just stone. Perfect, seamless, oppressive. But the strangest thing was the sound. Or rather, the total absence of it. Even the researcher's breath felt muted. Their heartbeat, usually loud in enclosed spaces, seemed swallowed by the walls. It wasn't natural silence. It was engineered silence, an acoustic vacuum. The researcher's skin prickled. In this space, even thought felt louder. Then came the second chamber. This one was longer, rectangular, its walls lined with deep grooves. At first they seemed decorative, but when the researcher stepped inside, a strange thing happened. The grooves amplified the faintest movement. A shuffle of the boot echoed like footsteps. The rustle of clothing sounded like whispers. Each sound rippled unnaturally, unless the researcher stood perfectly still. A realization struck with chilling clarity. The builders wanted the visitor to face their own sounds, their own presence, their own mind. But the third chamber was something else entirely. A pitch-black hallway led to a vast underground chamber so dark the flashlight beam seemed to dissolve into nothingness. The air felt thick and heavy, as though filled with unseen presence. The walls were rougher here, not polished, not carved, but hewn in jagged patterns that caught the faintest hint of light in sharp angles. The guide, who refused to accompany the researcher past the first chamber, had warned them, "Do not stay long in the third darkness. If you hear breathing that is not your own, leave." The researcher had laughed at first, but standing there, in the pulse of ancient silence, the warning no longer felt like superstition, because they did hear breathing, slow, steady, deep, but the sound didn't come from any direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. They turned off their flashlight, and the darkness became absolute, so complete that even the afterimage of light vanished instantly. The human eye has limits, but this chamber defeated more than vision. It defeated orientation. The mind strained to find edges, movement, anything familiar. That's when the carvings revealed themselves, not through light but through touch. The researcher's fingertips brushed against the stone and felt a shape unlike anything seen in earlier chambers. Figures, many figures, tall ones with elongated limbs and oval heads, eerily similar to those inside the obsidian chamber. Their faces were blank, featureless, watching without eyes. But these carvings were different. Each elongated figure was positioned in cracks, corners, transitions between blocks, as though emerging from the stone itself. Guardians, witnesses, or prisoners. The carvings were not merely symbolic. They were placed exactly where human perception breaks down in total darkness, where the mind begins to project shapes into the void. The builders knew what darkness does to the brain. They harnessed it, controlled it, weaponized it. The longer the researcher stayed, the more their perception dissolved. Their sense of distance warped. Their thoughts grew distorted, looping back on themselves. The sound of breathing grew louder, not mechanical, not human. Rhythmic, pulsing, almost patterned. Something felt present. Not threatening, not welcoming, just present. Presence older than language. The researcher tried to steady their breathing, but the chamber responded. A low vibration rippled through the stone floor, so faint they questioned whether it was real. They whispered into the darkness, "Is someone there?" The echo came back wrong. Not delayed, not distorted, just wrong, as if responding in a different tone than the whisper that left their lips. They stumbled backward, heartbeats slamming in their chest. A faint glimmer appeared on the wall, just a trick of the eyes, but for a split second, it looked like two elongated figures separating from the stone and shifting in the darkness. Hallucination, hypoxia, sensory distortion, or something else, something the architects intended the visitor to perceive. The chamber was designed to break the boundary between internal perception and external presence. A training ground for altered consciousness. A place where visions were induced not by drugs, but by architecture. The researcher forced themselves to leave before the chamber consumed their sense of self entirely. As they crawled back into the upper corridors, the darkness clung to their thoughts like thick mist. When they finally emerged into daylight, gasping, the guide stared at them with grim understanding. "You saw them," he said softly. Not a question, a statement. The researcher tried to speak, but the words stuck in their throat. "Everyone who goes far enough sees them," the guide continued. "Those who built the temples put them there to watch, to test, to remind." "To remind of what?" the researcher managed to ask. The guide looked toward the mountains. "That the ancients were never alone," he whispered. "And neither are we." That night, as the researcher lay awake in their tent, they could still hear the breathing from the chamber. Slow, rhythmic, impossible to forget. They realized something horrifying. The carvings weren't just meant to depict guardians. They were meant to teach the pilgrims how to recognize them. Because whatever the ancients encountered, whatever they communicated with in those depths, was not of stone and not of light. It lived in the folds of darkness, and the temples were built to bring humans face to face with it. Now, after thousands of years of silence, the darkness was starting to move again. The deeper the researcher went into the mysteries of the temples, the more a single idea began to take shape, an idea the ancients seemed to have understood instinctively, but which modern science was only beginning to approach. The temples were not isolated structures. They were part of a network wired through the Andes themselves, not connected by roads, not connected by tribes, connected by energy. At first, the researcher resisted the thought. It sounded like fringe mysticism, the kind of pseudo-archaeology rejected by any serious scholar. But when evidence begins to accumulate from dozens of unrelated sources, from geology, acoustics, magnetism, anthropology, myth, skepticism has no choice but to bend. It began with a pattern. Every temple, from the smallest stone platform to the massive sealed sanctuary, aligned not only with specific stars, but also with each other. When the researcher plotted their coordinates on a high-resolution map, the layout formed a web-like geometry stretching across hundreds of miles. Not random, not approximate, precise. The temples formed a looping grid, spirals, triangles, mirrored lines, mirroring the same constellation of the ancient sky that kept appearing in underground symbols and obsidian mirrors. But this was only the first layer. Local shamans spoke of places where the mountains sing to each other, where wind patterns echo from ridge to ridge in rhythmic pulses. Engineers explained it as natural acoustics, but the timing felt too deliberate. During certain months, sound traveled evenly between specific peaks, as if channeled. Then came the discovery of magnetite anomalies. The same magnetic minerals found in temple stones appeared in strange concentrations beneath the ground, veins of magnetite forming invisible pathways between temple sites. When the researcher tested these regions with handheld sensors, they detected subtle electromagnetic pulses, too faint for mainstream detection, but consistent enough to map. And the pulses followed the layout of the temples exactly. The mountains weren't just landscape, they were conductors. Massive slabs of magnetite-rich stone served as natural circuits. Under the right conditions, solar storms, geomagnetic shifts, or acoustically induced resonance, these geological structures could transmit frequencies across enormous distances. The researcher realized with a shiver, the temples were designed to communicate with each other. Not by sight, not by human carriers, by resonance. The Andean elders had said for centuries, "The mountains speak." It wasn't metaphor. It was literal. When wind passed through one temple's stone vents, a unique frequency vibrated through the rock. That frequency traveled through the magnetite veins underground. Another temple, positioned on the same line, responded, its own stones humming faintly in reply. The researcher had dismissed these stories as myth. But myth, it seems, remembers. One particularly revealing test occurred at sunset at Temple 7. The researcher produced a single tone in the resonant chamber, a long, steady note, identical to the ones encoded in the obsidian carvings. The temple hummed in reply, but what chilled the researcher wasn't the response. It was the echo that followed. 5 seconds after the temple's resonance faded, another hum rose from the distant mountains. Faint, distant, but unmistakably real. A temple responding from miles away, activated not by human presence, but by the vibration passing through the earth. The network was alive. Then came something even stranger. Villagers near Lake Titicaca reported glowing lights along the ridges on nights when the temples hummed. Not bright, not supernatural, just faint bluish glows that shimmered at the edges of vision. The researcher initially dismissed them as bioluminescent insects or temperature inversions, but after several nights of observation, they saw it too. Thin, wavering lines of pale light tracing along the mountains. Not quite lightning, not quite reflection, something in between. It appeared when the wind struck certain temple vents at precise angles, as if airborne ions were reacting to low-frequency vibrations in the stone. Ancient communication, electric whispering, stone speaking to stone across the night. But if the temples could communicate, the question became, what were they saying? The answer emerged from an unexpected place: the resonance patterns recorded in the underground chamber. When the researcher translated the patterns into visual waveforms, the shapes matched the layout of the temple grid. The temples were echoing the map of their own network. A feedback loop, a self-referencing system, like a machine testing its circuits. And then came the most chilling discovery of all. The temple network hummed strongest not during solstices or equinoxes, but during rare astronomical alignments. Moments when the sky resembled the ancient configuration encoded in the obsidian mirrors. Moments when the Earth approached the same axial tilt it held 12,000 years ago. Moments when the drowned kingdoms supposedly fell and the sky twisted like a serpent. These alignments were returning. Slowly, gradually, but unmistakably. Each time the stars drifted closer to their ancient positions, the temples hummed louder. The underground resonance grew stronger. The mountains glowed longer. And the dream reports in nearby villages increased. The elders had warned the researcher. The mountains will speak again when the sky remembers. The sky was remembering. Whatever happened 12 millennia ago, the great sky shift, the resonance awakening, the drowned kingdoms, the sisterhood's intervention, it is beginning again. The temple network was not built as a monument to the past. It was built as a warning system, a system designed to wake when the cycle returned. A system built to prepare human consciousness. A system the ancients hoped future generations would learn to read. But no one alive knows how to read it anymore. The hums are increasing. The lights lasting longer. The winds resonating more powerfully. Something is approaching. Something enormous. Inevitable. And ancient. The temples are not just remembering the past. They are calling out to the future. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the network is fully awake. By the time the medieval Islamic Golden Age reached its height, the intellectual fabric of the Middle East had become a patchwork of civilizations: Greek, Persian, Mesopotamian, Indian, Arabian. Knowledge traveled through scholars like caravans through desert passes, and libraries swelled with manuscripts from every culture that had left its mark on the region. In this vibrant intellectual world, certain patterns began to emerge. Patterns so subtle that only the most attentive historians notice them today. Quiet references to ancient watchers, hidden orders, and the inner law slip into the writings of philosophers, astronomers, and scholars of metaphysics. To most, these were poetic flourishes. To others, metaphors. But to a few modern researchers, they resemble faint fingerprints, ghostly impressions left by a tradition far older than the scholars themselves understood. The most unexpected of these traces appear in the work of medieval Islamic philosophers grappling with questions of governance, ethics, and the nature of leadership. They speak of rulers guided by unseen moral codes, of elites responsible not only to their people but to higher principles beyond worldly law. These descriptions echo the Brotherhood's unwritten doctrine, the law above the king. One particularly puzzling manuscript, attributed to a 12th century Persian scholar, contains the line, "A ruler must hold counsel not only with those he sees, but with those who see him." The phrase is enigmatic, but its structure and imagery resemble teachings preserved in the Brotherhood's surviving fragments. It suggests a view of leadership that assumes the presence of invisible advisors, not as literal individuals, but as a philosophical necessity. Yet the origin of such ideas is unclear. The scholar offers no explanation, no source, only the cryptic statement. In the secretive world of medieval political philosophy, such metaphors were sometimes coded references shared among a small circle of intellectuals. Perhaps these scholars had absorbed inherited fragments of a much older tradition, fragments passed down through temple lore, Sasanian court rituals, or the teaching lineages of wandering ascetics who carried pieces of forgotten wisdom without recognizing its origin. The Brotherhood's influence also appears in the era's fascination with geometry and sacred architecture. Medieval scholars studied the symbolic meaning of shapes, particularly the importance of circles, symmetry, and the number 7. Some of the most prominent mystical architects argued that certain buildings, mosques, mausoleums, madrasas, should be constructed according to ancient cosmic principles to reflect balance in the world. In manuscripts describing these principles, One finds references to the Watchers who preserved the measure in ages past. Again, most historians treat this as metaphorical language inspired by Sufi mysticism. But the phrasing is strangely reminiscent of the Brotherhood's imagery, preserved in coded temple inscriptions and the unburnt manuscripts found beneath Persepolis. The medieval scholars who wrote these lines likely did not know of the Brotherhood. They had no reason to suspect such a group ever existed. But ideas move in mysterious ways, slipping across centuries, reshaped, translated, merged with new traditions. What the scholars saw as mystical wisdom may have been the distant echo of a political philosophical tradition that once guided kings from the shadows. More startling are the scattered accounts found in travel diaries and court chronicles. A 13th-century traveler from Nishapur writes about a secluded group of scholars living near the ruins of an ancient fire temple. He describes them as keepers of old knowledge, who rejected formal titles and taught that truth must be preserved in silence. When asked about their origin, they replied that their lineage stretched back to the time of kings who listened to hidden voices. The traveler assumed they were eccentrics. But their teachings, preserved only in passing remarks, carry hints of Brotherhood philosophy. Secrecy, observation, moral guardianship, hidden truth. In another account, a historian from Isfahan describes a meeting with a mysterious ascetic who claimed that the true wisdom of the empire had never been destroyed, only hidden in wandering minds. Such statements were common among mystics, but this one included references to 7 teachers and the Watchers who once walked beside kings. When questioned, the ascetic refused to elaborate. The historian dismissed him as delusional. Yet the phrasing reappears centuries later in unrelated manuscripts, woven into metaphysical discussions by scholars unaware of its origin. These fragments form a faint constellation. No single point proves anything, but viewed together, they suggest that something of the Brotherhood survived, not as an institution, but as a rumor buried in philosophical tradition, as an idea whispered across generations. The most compelling evidence of such survival comes from a 14th-century Persian treatise on moral governance. The anonymous author writes that true political power requires those who watch the Watchers, a phrase strikingly similar to the Brotherhood's belief that even the king must be held accountable by an invisible moral order. The treatise describes a system in which a small group of wise men, unknown to the public, unnamed in official records, advise rulers on maintaining justice and cosmic balance. The author insists that such men must remain unseen, unpraised, and unknown, for visibility corrupts their purpose. No empire of that era, Islamic or otherwise, employed such a system, and yet the author writes of it as though describing a known, if long forgotten, ideal. Where did this idea come from? Perhaps from the lingering shadows of the Brotherhood's diaspora. Perhaps from Sasanian advisors whose traditions survived the transition into Islamic administration. Or perhaps from memories embedded in old families, rituals, and philosophical circles. Memories that survived even after their origin was lost. The most provocative possibility arises from hints that certain medieval scholars were aware, in vague terms, of a lost Persian order that guided rulers in antiquity. A few manuscripts refer to it obliquely as the Silent Ones, or the Keepers of Ancient Counsel. These references are rare and typically couched in allegory, but they suggest that the Brotherhood's story, though never recorded openly, may have echoed faintly through the oral traditions of scholars who understood that history is full of things that cannot be written. By the end of the medieval period, these echoes had faded into poetic metaphor. The Brotherhood was no longer a memory but an instinct, a sense that behind the visible world lies a hidden order, guiding, shaping, and balancing. An idea embraced by mystics, philosophers, and poets who believe that truth is seldom obvious, that power requires unseen wisdom, and that civilizations are built not only on stone and sword but on the quiet decisions of those who choose to remain invisible. The Brotherhood had not returned. It had dissolved into myth, metaphor, and philosophy. But myths, especially those rooted in truth, have a way of enduring. And centuries later, their faint imprint still lingered in the writings of scholars who whispered about watchers, hidden counsels, and the mystery of unseen wisdom. The hidden chamber, as a repository of secrets and symbols, was not merely a private indulgence. It existed within a world of political tension, intrigue, and potential betrayal. Hadrian's Rome was a place of immense power, where alliances were fragile, loyalties shifted like sand, and information was currency more valuable than gold. Within this context, the chamber may have functioned as both sanctuary and safeguard, holding documents, artifacts, or knowledge that could destabilize the empire if mishandled. To understand the chamber is to understand not only Hadrian's genius but also the precarious world in which he operated, a world in which secrecy was essential to survival. Hadrian was acutely aware of the threats around him. Senators, generals, and provincial governors all held varying degrees of power and influence, and the emperor's decisions often provoked envy, ambition, or dissent. Letters, reports, and sensitive documents may have been stored in the hidden chamber, detailing plots, allegiances, and betrayals. If exposed, such information could have toppled careers, incited rebellion, or even threatened the emperor's life. The chamber, then, is as much a fortress as it is a reflection of Hadrian's intellect, a place where control over knowledge equated to control over destiny. Historical records hint at tensions within Hadrian's inner circle. Trusted advisors sometimes became rivals, confidants occasionally turned traitors, and the emperor had to navigate a delicate web of relationships to maintain authority. It is plausible that the chamber contained not only administrative or strategic materials but also personal correspondences, letters revealing private sentiments, philosophical debates, or candid opinions about the empire and its leaders. Such documents would have been invaluable for understanding the political landscape, and equally dangerous if discovered by the wrong person. Hadrian's foresight in protecting them underscores his understanding of human nature, ambition, and the fragility of trust. The human stakes surrounding the chamber extend beyond political power to matters of personal loyalty and betrayal. Servants, aides, and courtiers, aware of its existence, may have been required to navigate complex instructions, interpret coded messages, or perform specific rituals to gain access. In a society where failure or indiscretion could result in severe consequences, the chamber would have been a crucible of obedience, observation, and discretion. Those who entered, or attempted to enter, without the emperor's guidance risked exposure, disgrace, or worse. The chamber's very existence is a testament to Hadrian's recognition of the danger inherent in knowledge and the necessity of controlling who could possess it. Some historians speculate that the chamber may have also contained sensitive information about succession, alliances, or military strategy. Rome's borders were vast, and the empire faced constant threats from external forces as well as internal unrest. Plans for troop deployments, fortifications, or diplomatic maneuvers could have been documented in the chamber, making it a critical node of imperial security. Its concealment would ensure that vital knowledge remained protected, accessible only to those with both authorization and understanding. In this sense, the chamber functioned as a safeguard for the empire itself, a repository of power and foresight meticulously hidden within the villa's labyrinthine design. The emotional stakes for those close to Hadrian cannot be overlooked. Courtiers, confidants, and servants would have been acutely aware of the risks surrounding the chamber. A single misstep, misinterpretation of a symbol, misplacement of an artifact, or revelation of a secret path could lead to personal ruin. This environment of tension and vigilance creates a human drama that is as compelling as the architectural and symbolic intrigue. The hidden chamber, therefore, is not only a space of intellectual challenge but a stage for human psychology, where loyalty, ambition, and fear converge. Betrayal, in particular, may have been a constant concern. Hadrian's own experiences with intrigue and rebellion likely informed the villa's design, leading him to embed layers of deception, misdirection, and concealment. False panels, misaligned mosaics, and deliberately misleading pathways may have served as safeguards against discovery by those with malicious intent. The architecture itself becomes a mechanism of trust and mistrust, a reflection of the emperor's understanding that power is most vulnerable when knowledge is accessible to those who would exploit it. Political intrigue also intersects with philosophy and symbolism within the villa. Hadrian's use of allegory, mosaics, and celestial alignment may have been designed not only to protect the chamber, but also to convey subtle messages about governance, morality, and the nature of power. A careful observer could glean insights into the emperor's philosophy, his perspective on loyalty and justice, and the principles by which he governed. In this way, the chamber operates simultaneously as a repository of sensitive information, a protective device, and a reflection of Hadrian's worldview. Stories of hidden betrayal circulate in ancient accounts, often veiled in rumor or myth, but they hint at the stakes surrounding the emperor's secrets. Courtiers who overstepped boundaries or misread instructions were likely dealt with quietly, reinforcing the necessity of discretion and obedience. The hidden chamber, therefore, embodies both physical and social control. It protects knowledge while regulating access through a combination of architectural ingenuity and human understanding. To enter the chamber was to engage not only with mechanics and symbolism but with a system of trust, loyalty, and calculated risk. Even Hadrian himself was not immune to the pressures of political intrigue. Personal letters, recorded speeches, and anecdotal accounts suggest a ruler deeply aware of the dangers surrounding him, one who understood that intelligence was both a weapon and a liability. The valley did not feel like the same place it had been the night before. Something had shifted, not just in the sky, not just in the mountains, but in reality itself. The air tasted different, sharp with metallic undertones. Colors seemed too bright, shadows too deep. Even gravity felt slightly wrong, as if the world had tilted by a fraction of a fraction, an imperceptible change with catastrophic potential. The villagers sensed it immediately. They whispered of Pachacudi, the turning of the world. The researcher, trembling and sleepless, climbed the ridge where the sisterhood had stood. The ground still shimmered faintly where the beams of temple light had converged. The air there hummed with residual energy, vibrating through the bones, as if the earth itself were still catching its breath. The sisterhood was gone, but they had left traces, footprints in a perfect circle, scraps of red cloth caught in the thorns, the faint scent of incense carried on the wind. A circle, always a circle, the sacred geometry of the ancients. The researcher walked to the center of that circle, heart pounding, and found something half buried under a thin layer of dust. A polished stone disc, obsidian black, cool to the touch, etched with spirals and lines identical to the oldest temple carvings. But unlike any artifact they had ever seen, this one glowed faintly from within. The moment the researcher lifted it, a pulse surged through their body, a jolt of recognition, fear, and something disturbingly close to understanding. The disc was not a relic. It was a key, and the key was awakening. As the researcher held it, visions flooded their mind, not dreams but memories. Memories belonging not to a person but to the temples themselves. They saw a time before mountains had their modern shape. A sky with constellations unfamiliar to any human alive today. A civilization aligned not around kings or empires, but around the stars. Architects working in silence, carving stone that hummed with memory. Children ascending to mountaintops with serene acceptance. A sisterhood guiding them through rituals meant to bind the human mind to the earth's pulse. The 14th temple shimmering between realities like a mirage. A catastrophic flash. Light ripping across the heavens in a violent arc, cities drowning in moments. Wind carrying sand that erased whole elders of knowledge. Mountains splitting, stars falling. Then darkness, long darkness, and the survivors, those who understood what had happened, building a system of temples, grids, and breath machines to make sure humanity would never again face the sky unprepared. The visions shifted. Now the researcher saw the present. The beams of light, the spiraling sky, the sisterhood breathing in unison. And finally, they saw something that turned their blood to ice. A pattern in the stars. One the ancients had feared. One that marked the beginning of the great cycle. One that was happening now. A voice resonated through the vision. Not spoken, not heard, but understood. The sky remembers. Now the earth must. The researcher collapsed to their knees, gasping, the obsidian disc still glowing faintly in their hands. When they looked up, they were not alone. An elder from the village stood at the ridge's edge, eyes wide with terror and awe. "You saw it," she whispered. "Didn't you?" The researcher nodded, unable to speak. The elder stepped closer, lowered her voice, and said, "The key found you. That means you must open the path." "What path?" the researcher managed to choke out. The elder pointed toward the jagged silhouette of the mountains, toward the direction of the sealed 13th temple and the region where the 14th flickered like a ghost between worlds. "The path they left for the next cycle," she said. Then her voice cracked, trembling. "And the cycle has begun." The researcher felt the weight of the obsidian disc grow heavier, pulsing in their palm like a second heartbeat. The mountains hummed faintly in response, as if recognizing the artifact after thousands of years, or welcoming it home. Distant thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. The ground trembled. Another pulse rippled through the stone grid beneath their feet. The temples were not done. The activation was entering its second phase. And whatever came next, humanity had not faced in 12,000 years. The researcher stood weakly, gripping the disc, the final realization crashing over them like cold rain. The temples were not merely warning beacons. They were instructions, a blueprint for surviving the next sky shift. And only one last step remained, to understand what the 14th temple hid. To unlock the sealed chamber beneath the 13th. To follow the path the ancients left. Before the cycle completed. Before the sky changed fully. Before humanity faced the storm unprepared. The researcher looked out across the trembling mountains, the shifting stars, the trails of light still fading from the horizon, and whispered the words the sisterhood had spoken centuries ago, in the night of their final ritual. "We remember. We walk. We awaken." But the truth, heavy and terrifying, remained. Now that the temples had awakened, there was no turning back. The first shift came with a vibration so soft it barely stirred the dust. But it was enough. Everyone in the valley felt it. Prickle along the spine, a faint tightening in the lungs, a sense that the world had paused mid-breath. The researcher felt the obsidian disc come alive in their hand, pulsing in perfect rhythm with the humming ground. It was as if the stone remembered where it belonged, as if the temples were calling it back. Then the wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Silence crashed across the valley, thick and absolute. Even the leaves hung motionless in the air. Every villager turned toward the mountains as a single, impossibly low tone rose from the earth, like the opening note of something vast awakening. The elders whispered, "The path is returning," and they were right. As the rising sun stretched its first beams across the valley floor, the shadows aligned with uncanny precision. The land answered the hum. A thin, ruler-straight line of ancient stone, long buried beneath centuries of soil, shimmered into visibility. A road. Its polished black slabs reflected the growing light, glowing from beneath with faint blue symbols that matched every spiral and constellation carved into the temples. It was the conduit pathway, the one the ancients built not for trade or travel, but for a specific moment in the sky's cycle. A moment just like this one. The researcher stepped onto the slab. The disc in their hand flared like a captured star. A wave of energy surged outward, illuminating the entire road in spiraling patterns. The villagers cried out, not in fear, but in awe. The thin blue light twisted like veins beneath the pathway, pulsing in time with some deep, planetary rhythm. This was no simple road. This was a bridge between worlds. As the researcher walked, the mountains vibrated softly, recognizing the key, guiding it. The path wound upward into a narrowing canyon. Each step pulled them deeper into a pressure-filled silence, as if space itself were thickening. Symbols carved into the canyon walls flickered to life. Spirals breathed. Lines expanded and contracted like living lungs. The air grew colder, heavier, electric. At the canyon's end, an archway stood, not built, grown, carved seamlessly from a single slab of iridescent stone. Its surface rippled as if made from frozen water. Its spirals brightened when the researcher approached, synced perfectly with the disk's glow. They stepped through. For a heartbeat, the world blurred. Colors bent. Sound inverted. Gravity twisted like fabric. And then the 14th temple stood before them. Solid, radiant, awake, no flicker, no illusion, no half-existence. A structure of shimmering stone and fluid geometry, pulsing with slow, rhythmic light, like the heart of the mountain laid bare. The researcher understood instantly. Everything the ancients created led here. Every dream, every hum, every ritual. This temple was the core. And now, after 12,000 years, it had returned for them. The chamber felt alive the moment the researcher stepped inside. Red light pulsed through the walls like a slow heartbeat, illuminating veins of stone that brightened with each breath they took. The obsidian disc trembled in their hand, then lifted on its own, drawn toward the center of the room. There it floated, a sphere of absolute darkness, suspended above a circular platform. Not a hole, not a shadow, a tear. The air thickened as the disc began to spin around it, releasing flashes of light that the sphere swallowed hungrily. The chamber vibrated. The temperature dropped, and then everything froze. Light halted mid-glow. The hum collapsed into silence. Even the researcher's heartbeat seemed to pause. A voice entered, not through ears, but through thought. The cycle has begun. You stand where the first watchers fell. Visions flooded their mind. A sky twisting into new shapes. Constellations tearing apart. Mountains rising in hours. Oceans swallowing entire kingdoms. The ancients building the temples as anchors for human consciousness. Not to stop the shift, but to survive it. They saw the sisterhood sealing the 14th temple when it grew unstable, hiding it between realities until the sky returned to its ancient pattern. And now that pattern was back. The sphere pulsed once more, sending a cold tremor through the researcher's body. The remembering must be led, the voice said, or humanity will break again. The sphere collapsed inward, vanishing in a silent implosion. The obsidian disc shattered into 3 glowing shards that hovered around the researcher like small, waiting spirits. Outside, the sky was rearranging itself. Stars swirling into constellations unseen for 12,000 years. The mountains hummed. The world vibrated with awakening energy. The researcher understood. The temples were not warnings. They were instructions. And now they had become the guide humanity desperately needed.